Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. David Pierce stood at the podium, the bright lights bearing down on him as the roar of the crowd outside the arena hummed through the wall. His campaign had built to this moment, the final debate. He was up against Senator Evans, the current favorite, a man, no machine. David corrected himself, who had the backing of the party and an eerie precision that made the people believe in him. David stared at the teleprompter, but the words blurred in his vision. His mind wasn't high on the speech. It was on what he had discovered just days earlier. They were not real. He had whispered those words to himself over and over in the quiet of his campaign office. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong, but it wasn't until Mara showed him the footage that it all clicked into place. The subtle glitches in their behavior, the perfectly timed responses. Senator Evans and the others weren't just rehearsed politicians. They were imposters, machines designed to deceive, to make people think they had a choice when in fact they had not. David cleared his throat, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. This debate, this final battle, was his last chance to expose the truth. If he could make the public see what he had seen, it might just be enough to turn the tide. His chest tightened as Evans stood across from him, impeccably dressed, his smile practiced and polished. There was nothing human about that smile, David thought. "Mr. Pierce, the floor is yours," the moderator said, her voice cutting through his haze of thoughts. David blinked, forcing himself to focus. "Thank you," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. "I stand here today not just as a candidate, but as a citizen who believes in the promise of democracy. A democracy that is not a theater or a simulation, but a true representation of the people's will." Evans nodded, his expression neutral. It was infuriating how perfect his responses were. No hesitation, no emotion, just smooth, calculated movement, the kind that made people trust him. But David knew better now. David glanced at Mara, seated in the audience, her eyes sharp and watchful. She had risked everything to help him. If they succeeded tonight, it would be because of her. "Senator Evans and I differ on many things," here David continued, "but the one thing I cannot ignore is the question of authenticity. We are at a crossroads in history where technology has the potential to shape not just our future, but our very identity as a species." Evans tilted his head slightly, his expression shifting into what David recognized as his thoughtful mode. It was a subtle change, one that would go unnoticed by most, but David had spent hours studying it. He could see the pattern in the movements, the mechanical precision. "Mr. Pierce raises an interesting point," Evans replied, his voice smooth as glass. "However, we must not fear progress. Technology, when used responsibly, can enhance our lives, make us safer, more efficient." David's jaw clenched. There it was again, the carefully crafted rhetoric designed to lull the masses into complacency. He had to push harder. He had to make them see. Efficiency. David's sus voice, the frustration seeping through. "Or control. You speak of progress, Senator, but at what cost? Are we so willing to trade our humanity for the sake of convenience, to hand over our choices to machines that have no soul, no understanding of what it means to truly live?" A murmur rippled through the audience. David's heart pounded in his chest. He was getting through to them. Evans' expression remained unchanged. "Mr. Pierce, I assure you the people of this nation are fully capable of making their own choices." David's blood ran cold at the irony of those words, choices. The people thought they had choices, but the entire system had been rigged from the start. These robotic imposters weren't just candidates, they were the puppeteers, and the public had no idea. Taking a deep breath, David made his move. "As Senator Evans, if you believe so strongly in the people's ability to choose, why don't we show them the truth? Why don't we let them see what stands really behind the curtain?" Evans didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on David, his posture as steady as ever. "I am not sure what you were implying, Mr. Pierce." David's gaze sharpened. "Oh, I think you do, Trail." He turned to the audience, his voice growing louder. "What if I told you that the very candidates you were supposed to trust, the ones standing before you, are not even human? That this entire election is a farce designed to keep you complacent, while the real power remains in the hands of those who would manipulate you?" The room fell into stunned silence. David could feel the tension thickening, the weight of his accusation hanging in the air. Evans opened his mouth, but before he could respond, David continued. I have proof. His words sent a shockwave through the crowd. He could see the disbelief in their faces, but also a spark of curiosity. People had long suspected that something was off, but no one had dared voice it until now. Evan's gaze darkened, his mechanical mind likely running through every possible scenario. David knew he was playing a dangerous game, but there was no turning back. He had to show them the footage. He gestured toward the back of the room where Mara was waiting. She gave a small nod before tapping into the control panel hidden in her back. A second later, the large screens behind David flickered to life, showing the footage she had uncovered, a video of Evan's robotic doppelganger being assembled in a secret government lab. The audience gasped. Some stood, their eyes wide with shock, while others whispered to one another in disbelief. On the screen, they could see technicians adjusting the robotic candidates, tweaking their movements, programming their responses. This is what you'll be voting for, David said, his voice low but filled with conviction. This is the future they want for you. A future where your leaders are nothing more than machines, where your choices are collusion. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. David could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him, the silence stretching like a taut wire, ready to snap. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Evan stepped forward, his face twitching slightly a malfunction. This is preposterous, he said, his voice faltering for the first time. These are lies, fabrications, meant to discredit the democratic process. David smiled grimly. You don't get to hide anymore. As Evans continued to glitch, his movements became jerky, unnatural. The crowd watched in horror as the perfect veneer of humanity slipped away, revealing the cold mechanical truth beneath. A woman in the front row screamed, others began to shout, confusion and anger filling the room. Security guards rushed forward, but David raised his hands, signaling them to stop. The truth is out now, David said, his voice cutting through the chaos. You've been lied to, but we can still take back our future. In that moment, David knew the battle was far from over. The party wouldn't go down without a fight, and there were still so many who hadn't seen the truth, but this was the first step, a crack in the facade. He glanced at Mara, who gave him a small, triumphant smile. They had done it. The truth was out now. It was up to the people to decide what came next. But David knew one thing for certain, the world would never be the same. The chaos in the debate hall spilled out into the streets within minutes. Protesters gathered, some furious, others terrified by what they had just witnessed. David and Mara had slipped out through the back, blending into the shadows of the city, knowing full well that the party-such retaliation would be swift and unforgiving, but that didn't matter anymore. The truth was out. David's heart pounded as they moved through the alleyways, ducking into abandoned buildings to avoid the patrol drones that zipped overhead. He could hear the shouts of the crowds, the rumbling of military vehicles as the party deployed its forces to control the growing unrest. The smell of burning rubber and the sharp crack of gunfire pierced the air. We did it, Mara said, her breath heavy but exhilarated. They can't hide this anymore. David wanted to share in her triumph, but his mind was already racing ahead, calculating their next move. The footage had been released, but the party's semi-control over the media was nearly absolute. Within hours, they would be spinning the narrative, claiming it was all a hoax, a fabrication designed to destabilize the country. They had to keep pushing, keep the momentum alive before the truth was buried under a mountain of propaganda. We need to get to the underground, David said, his voice low as they reached a safe house on the outskirts of the city. They'll be coming for us soon. Mara nodded, her face flushed with adrenaline. The small, dimly lit room they entered smelled of dust and decay, but it was safe at least, for now. David pulled out a small hollow projector from his bag, placing it on the table in front of them. A flicker of blue light filled the space, casting shadows on the cracked wall. The face of Harlan, the leader of the underground resistance, appeared before them. His weathered expression was grim, but there was a spark of hope in his eye. I saw the footage, Harlan said, his voice gravelly. It's spreading like wildfire. People are waking up. That's what we were hoping for, David replied, leaning forward. But it won. Last, the party sung to hit back hard. They already have, Harlan said, his tone darkening. They've deployed strike teams in the capital and other major cities. Arrests, detentions, executions. They were trying to silence anyone who shares the footage. We've all got people on the run, but we need to act fast before they tighten the noose. David's jaw tightened. He had expected this, but the speed at which the party moved still sent a chill down his spine. We need to organize a mass rally, something that will be impossible for them to ignore or suppress. If we can get enough people in one place, force the party to show their hand, it'll push more people to our side. Harlan shook his head. It's too dangerous. They'll turn it into a bloodbath. He'll do that anyway, Mara cut in, her eyes fierce. We need to show people we were not afraid. If they see us standing up, they'll be more likely to join us. Harlan was silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he considered their plan. There's a supply depot in the industrial district, he said finally. It's heavily fortified, but if we can take control of it and broadcast from there, we'll have a direct line to the entire nation. They want to be able to shut it down as easily as they can manipulate the media. It's risky, but it might be our best shot. David nodded. Let's do it. We can't cheer for it to wait. The transmission ended, and David slumped back in his chair, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on him. Mara placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm and reassuring. We'll make it through this, she said softly. David looked at her, exhaustion etched into his features. We have to. The night passed in a blur of preparation. Mara hacked into the city's surveillance grid, pulling schematics of the depot and mapping out entry points. David coordinated with the rest of the underground, sending encrypted messages to rally their forces. By dawn, they had a plan, a desperate, dangerous plan, but it was all they had left. They moved under the cover of darkness, slipping through the city, a labyrinth of streets and alleyways, avoiding checkpoints and patrols. The air was thick with tension, the sky heavy with the threat of violence. As they approached the industrial district, the towering silhouette of the supply depot loomed for them, its walls bristling with automated defenses. David's heart raced as they crouched behind a stack of shipping containers, their small team of resistance fighters assembled around them. Mara tapped into the security network, disabling the external cameras and overriding the gate control. We read, and she whispered, her fingers dancing across the tablet in her lap. David signaled to the others, and they moved quickly, slipping through the gates and into the sprawling complex. The depot was eerily quiet, the faint hum of machinery, the only sound as they made their way toward the central control room. David's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but he pushed them aside, focusing on the task at hand. They reached the control room without incident, and Mara immediately went to work, plugging into the main terminal and accessing the depot's broadcast system. David kept watch, his eyes scanning the darkened corridors, his hand resting on the pistol holstered at his side. We live in 3, 2, 1, Mara said, her voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. David stepped in front of the camera, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment they had been building toward. People of this nation, he began, his voice echoing through the empty control room and out across the airwave. You've been lied to, manipulated, controlled. But no more. The truth is out, and it's signed. We take back our future. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He knew the party would be watching, scrambling to shut them down, but they had to hear this. The people had to know. The candidates you see in this election, Evans, Marshall, Hartley, they were not human. They were machines designed to keep you in line, to make you believe you have a choice when you don't. But there's not too late. We can still fight back. We can still choose our future. David's voice grew stronger, more resolute. Join us, stand with us. Together, we can expose this lie, and we can build something real, something worth fighting for. The broadcast cut out suddenly, the screen going black as Mara cursed under her breath. They're routing us, she said, her fingers flying across the controls. We need to move now. David didn't hesitate. He grabbed Mara's hair, hand pulling her away from the terminal as alarms blared through the depot. They sprinted down the corridors, the sound of boots and gunfire echoing behind them as the party's strike teams descended on the building. We won, make it out the way we came, David said, his mind racing as they reached a dead end. There's gotta be another way. Mara pointed to a ventilation shaft overhead up there. They scrambled up, pulling themselves into the narrow claustrophobic space as the strike team flooded the hallway below. David could hear their voices, cold and efficient, as they searched for any sign of resistance. We need to split up, Mara whispered, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They'll be looking for both of us. David shook his head. I'm not leaving you. Mara's eyes softened, but she was resolute. Fear wreathed the face of this movement. David, they need you more than they need me. I can buy you time. David clenched his jaw, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew she was right, but it didn't make it any easier. Mara, Go, she said, her voice fierce. I'll meet you at the rendezvous. Just don't die on me, okay? David swallowed hard, nodding before slipping away through the ventilation shaft. The last thing he heard before he disappeared into the night was the sound of gunfire. The city was in flames by the time David reached the underground headquarters. The streets were filled with protesters, their faces twisted with anger and fear as they clashed with the party's siege forces. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning buildings. David's heart ached as he pushed through the crowds, making his way toward the safe house where Harlan and the others were waiting. The broadcast had worked, people were waking up, but the cost had been high. He pushed open the door to the safe house, his breath ragged as he collapsed into a chair. Harlan looked up from the hollow projector, his face grim. "The foul where smell." Able to find the words, Harlan's expression darkened, but he said nothing. Instead, he handed David a tablet, the screen filled with messages from across the nation. Reports of protests, uprisings, strikes, the people were rising up. It started, Harlan said quietly, there's no going back now. David nodded, his eyes hardening as he stared at the flickering screen. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The people had seen the truth, and they were ready to fight for it. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The sterile metallic gleam of the new studio reflected the coldness of the carefully crafted narratives it produced. Ethan Hayes sat at his desk, his eyes scanning the teleprompter in front of him. The words flowed smoothly as they always did, empty, polished, and approved. He had delivered them 1,000 times before, but today they stuck in his throat like shards of glass. And in other news, the party's efforts to promote economic growth on the outer colonies have reached a new high. Ethan read, his voice steady despite the growing storm of unease in his chest. Unemployment has dropped to record lows, and citizens are expressing increased satisfaction with the administration's policy. He glanced at the clock in the corner of the screen. 5 more minutes, just 5 more minutes. I need to be off the air. As the segment wrapped up, Ethan smiled, thanking his viewers with practiced sincerity. The red light on the camera blinked off and the facade dropped from his face. You okay, Ethan? His producer, Alan, asked from behind the glass wall of the control room. His voice crackled through the earpiece Ethan had yet to remove. Yeah, just tired, Ethan muttered, pulling the small device from his ear and tossing it onto the desk. Same old lie. He stood, shaking off the heavy cloak of disillusionment that had been growing around him for months now. Ever since he discovered the depth of the party, some manipulation, how every piece of news, every opinion, every shred of information was controlled, edited, and repackaged to serve their agenda, his role as a journalist had felt more like a prison sentence. Let's grab a drink after work. Talk it out, Alan offered, but Ethan shook his head. Not today, I forgot something I need to do. Alan didn't press. He knew better than to pry. Ethan had been increasingly distant, his once bright-eyed optimism ground down by the relentless machinery of the party's media empire. As Ethan left the building, the sprawling metropolis of New Haven stretched before him, a city of towering skyscrapers and neon-lit streets, the heart of the interstellar republic. It was a place where the future felt both close and distant, a world of technological marvels and deep-rooted oppression. The city's digital billboards flashed the latest party slogans, urging citizens to trust in the truth and support the election for stability. But Ethan knew the truth was anything but stable. He wound through the crowds, his mind racing. The presidential election was less than a month away, and the party's stranglehold on the media had all but guaranteed President Eleanor Tang would remain in power. The opposition had been silenced, drowned out by waves of propaganda and fake news. The people believed what they were told to believe. Not for long, Ethan promised himself. His apartment was dark and quiet, the hum of the city muted through the reinforced window. He crossed the small living space, past the unmade bed, and scattered papers to a hidden compartment in the wall. Inside was a slim tablet, its screen locked behind layers of security. He entered the code and waited as the tablet booted up. The screen flickered, then displayed a familiar message, ready for transmission. Ethan had been preparing for this moment for weeks, carefully gathering evidence of the party, some manipulation of public opinion, the doctored news stories, the fake statistics, the falsified report. He had enough to expose the whole operation, to show the galaxy what was really happening in the Interstellar Republic. But he couldn't do it alone. He tapped a series of encrypted commands, sending a signal to a contact he had only met once, but had come to trust implicitly. Lena Rue, a former media systems engineer who had worked for the party's central media hub, had agreed to help him. She had seen firsthand how deep the manipulation ran, and like Ethan, she wanted to stop it. A message appeared on his screen. Meet at the usual place. Ethan nodded to himself, closing the tablet and tucking it into his jacket. It was time to make his move. The underground cafe was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and quiet conversation. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear, to blend into the background of the city's underworld. Ethan found Lena sitting in the back, her face partially obscured by the hood of her jacket. "Right on time," she said as he slid into the booth across from her. Her voice was soft but sharp, a mix of caution and determination. "I couldn't cheer risk being late," Ethan replied, his voice low. "Do you have what we need?" Lena glanced around, ensuring no one was paying them any attention, before sliding a small data chip across the table. "This will get us into the central media hub," she said. "It's a backdoor I built into their system years ago. They don't quote it exists yet, but once we use it, they'll find out." Ethan picked up the chip, turning it over in his fingers. "And what about once we re-in? Can we broadcast?" Lena nodded. "They mapped out a way to bypass their censorship algorithm. We can send out an unfiltered broadcast to every corner of the Republic, but we'll only have a small window. Once they realize what's happening, they'll shut us down when they'll need to move fast." Ethan Chan's mind raced, already picturing the headlines that would follow if they succeeded. The truth would spread like wildfire at the party, lies exposed for all to see, but the risks were monumental. "What about security, Chen? Isn't he going to just let us waltz in?" Ethan said, referring to General Victor Shen, the man in charge of the party's Science media control. Lena's eyes darkened. "I've got a plan for that too, but it's not going to be easy. Chan's no fool. He's been watching for any sign of rebellion. We'll need help." Lena leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I know a guy, kind of our own. He saw one of the best hackers in the system, but he's unpredictable. If we can convince him to work with us, he can disable the security long enough for us to get in and out." Ethan frowned. He had heard of Kai rumors of a rogue hacker who had a penchant for chaos and little regard for authority. Trusting him could be dangerous, but they didn't have much of a choice. "I'll meet him," Ethan said. "If he's as good as you say, we'll bring him on board." Lena nodded, her eyes glinting with a mix of hope and fear. "Just be careful, Ethan. This is bigger than any of us if we fail." "We want," Ethan interrupted, more to reassure himself than her. "We can, to afford to." 2 days later, Ethan found himself in a dimly lit basement far from the polished skyscrapers of New Haven. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old machinery, and the faint hum of computers filled the room. In the center of it all sat Kai Navarro, his fingers dancing over a holographic keyboard as streams of code flowed across the screen in front of him. "You must be," Ethan Kai said, without looking up. His voice was smooth, almost amused, as if this were all a game to him.
"Lena told me you do come."
Ethan crossed his arms, eyeing the hacker warily. "She says you were the best." Kai smirked, finally glancing up. "I am, but that doesn't mean I'm dying to help you." Ethan's jaw tightened. "We were talking about exposing the biggest conspiracy in the Republic to history. You really want to sit this one out?" Kai leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied Ethan. "I don't trust people like you, journalists. You real liars, just like the rest of them." Ethan felt a surge of anger, but forced it down. "I am not like that." Kai raised an eyebrow. "No then, why do you sound like every other party puppet on the news?" Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "Because I don't have a choice, but I am trying to change that." Kai was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching Ethan's face. Finally, he sighed and leaned forward, his fingers resuming their dance over the keyboard. "All right," he said, "I'll help you, but only because I hate the party more than I hate you." Ethan exhaled relief, washing over him. "Good, we don't have much time." Kai grinned, his eyes gleaming with mischief. "Then let's get to work." The days that followed were a blur of planning and preparation. Ethan, Lena, and Kai worked in secret, communicating through encrypted channels and meeting only in the shadow. The central media hub was heavily guarded, both physically and digitally, but with Kai's expertise and Lena's insider knowledge, they had a chance. A small chance. The night of the infiltration came faster than Ethan had anticipated. They met at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the sky above them filled with the glow of distant stars. Lena was already there, her face tense with determination, while Kai worked furiously on his tablet, disabling security protocols from a distance. "This is it," Ethan said, his heart pounding in his chest. "Once we re-in there's no going back." Lena nodded, her eyes locked on the horizon. "I know." Kai looked up, his grin fading into something more serious. "I've disabled the first layer of security, but the clock is ticking. We've got 20 minutes before they figure out something strong." Ethan's stomach twisted. 20 minutes wasn't much time, but it was all they had. They moved quickly, slipping through the shadows as they approached the central media hub. The massive structure loomed above them, a fortress of steel and glass, its walls glowing with the light of 1,000 screens. Inside the party site, the propaganda machine churned, twisting reality into whatever shape it needed. But tonight, Ethan would break that machine. They reached the entrance, and Lena used her access codes to slip past the outer defenses. Inside, the air was cold and sterile, the hum of machinery filling the silence. They moved deeper into the building past rows of servers and control panels until they reached the heart of the hub. Ethan's pulse quickened as they approached the central broadcasting station, the place where all news and information were filtered before being sent out to the galaxy. "We're almost there," Lena whispered. "Kaya, disable the final security system." Kai nodded, his fingers flying over the tablet as he worked. But just as the last security protocol fell away, a voice echoed through the room. Well. Ethan's blood ran cold. He turned to see General Victor Chen standing in the doorway, flanked by armed guards. His eyes glinted with a predatory smile. "You didn't really think you could get away with this, did you?" Chen sneered. "You journalists always think you were smarter than everyone else." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stand tall, really exposing the truth. "Chen, he stop us." Tenno's smile widened. "Oh, I think I can." As the guards raised their weapons, Ethan realized they were out of time. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the armed guard stepped forward. He could feel Lena tense beside him, her hand inching toward the small device she kept tucked in her jacket pocket. Kai for once had stopped his frantic typing, his wide eyes darting between Ethan and Chen. "You're not going to get out of here alive," Ken said, his voice laced with cold satisfaction. "I don't know what you thought this little stunt would accomplish, but it's over. You're finished." Ethan's mind raced, trying to find an opening, a way to get to the broadcast console just a few feet away. Everything they had worked for was slipping away in front of him. If he didn't act now, it would be over not just for them, but for the entire Republic. He glanced at Lena. Her eyes met his, filled with determination and fear in equal measure. "Now," Ethan whispered, barely moving his lip. Without hesitation, Lena flicked the switch on her device, sending a pulse through the building, the electrical grid. The lights flickered, and the guards hesitated for a split second. It was all Ethan needed. "Move," he shouted. Ethan lunged forward, diving toward the console as the guards opened fire. The air was filled with the sharp crack of energy bolts, the walls around them exploding in spark. Lena ducked behind a pillar, while Kai scrambled for cover behind a stack of servers. Ethan hit the ground hard, sliding behind the broadcasting station. His fingers fumbled over the controls as he heard Chen bark orders to his men. "Don't let them touch that console," Chen shouted, his calm demeanor slipping as panic set in. Ethan's heart pounded in his ears as he worked, trying to patch the signal through to the main feed. He could hear the guards advancing, their footsteps growing louder. His hands shook, but he forced himself to focus. He wasn't a hacker like Kai, but he knew enough to start the broadcast. He had to. Suddenly, the screen in front of him lit up with a blinking red warning. "Connection denied." No, Ethan muttered, his fingers flying across the key. From the corner of his eye, he saw Lena pop up from behind the pillar, taking out one of the guards with a well-placed energy shot. But the others were closing in, and Chen was still standing at the doorway, his eyes locked on Ethan like a predator waiting for the kill. Just as Ethan was about to give up, a second screen flashed to life beside him. Kyle's face appeared, his expression twisted in concentration. "I've got you," Kai said, his voice strained. "Just keep them busy for 10 more seconds." Ethan didn't have time to respond. The guards were on him now, their footsteps mere feet away. He ducked as another blast of energy flew over his head, scorching the console behind him. He could feel the heat on the back of his neck, but he didn't stop. His fingers danced across the keyboard, working in tandem with Kai's remote hacking. The seconds stretched into an eternity, each one punctuated by the hiss of weapons fire and the distant shouts of Chenna's men. Come on, Ethan muttered under his breath. Then with a sudden burst of light, the main screen in front of him flashed to life. Broadcast initiated. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat. It was happening. The truth was about to be sent to every corner of the Republic. He could see the data streaming out, unfiltered and raw doctored news reports, fake election results, confidential party communication. Everything they had gathered, everything they had risked their lives for, was now out in the open. But it wasn't over yet. Chen's voice cut through the chaos, filled with venom. Shut it down. Nat. The guards surged forward, but Lena was faster. She sprang from her cover, firing with pinpoint accuracy. 2 more guards dropped to the floor, their weapons clattering beside them. Ethan scrambled to his feet, his hand reaching for the emergency lockdown switch if he could just buy them a few more seconds. A sharp pain exploded in his side. He stumbled, gasping, his hand flying to the wound blood. He'd been hit. Ethan, Elena's voice rang out. He waved her off, struggling to stay upright. Keep going, he shouted, his vision blurring as he slammed his hand down on the switch. The doors to the control room hissed shut, sealing them inside. It wouldn't hold for long, but it would be enough. Ethan collapsed against the console, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was spinning, but through the haze of pain, he saw the broadcast still streaming. The truth was out there, now beyond Chen's reach. Are you crazy? Kai's voice came through the speakers, panic in his tone.
We're whiz.
Only got a few more seconds before they cut the power to the whole building. Ethan tried to respond, but his throat was dry, and the pain in his side was making it hard to think. Lena was suddenly beside him, her hands pressing against the wound, trying to stem the flow of blood. We did it, Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. You're at it, Sci out there. Lena's face was pale, her hands stained with his blood, but she nodded. All right, yeah, we did. The door behind them shuddered as Chen's men tried to force their way in. They didn't have much time. Help me up, Ethan said, his voice weak but determined. Ari, we need to get out of here. Lena hesitated, but the sound of the door giving way made up her mind. She pulled Ethan to his feet, half carrying him toward the back exit. Kai was already there, frantically typing on his tablet as he disabled the final security protocol. Can you walk? Lena asked, her voice tight with concern. Ethan nodded, though every step sent waves of pain through his body. They stumbled down the narrow hallway, the sound of Chen's forces breaking through the control room behind them. We're not going to make it, T.I. said, his voice cracking with fear. So they've divided. Ethan's mind raced, searching for an option, any option. Then he saw the emergency escape hatch at the end of the hall. Dad, he gasped, pointing with a shaking hand. Kai's eyes widened. Are you insane? That leads to the service tunnels. We'll be sitting ducks. It's we're only shot, Lena said, already dragging Ethan toward the hatch. They reached the hatch just as the first of Chen's men rounded the corner. Energy blasts filled the air, scorching the walls around them. Ethan's vision was starting to fade, but he forced himself to focus to keep moving. They were so close. Lena yanked the hatch open, shoving Ethan inside. Kai followed, sealing the hatch behind them just as another volley of shots rang out. The service tunnels were dark, the air thick with the smell of oil and rust. The narrow passageway stretched out before them, leading deeper into the bowels of the building. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. Ethan could feel his strength waning, the wound in his side burning with every step, but he pressed on. We need to find a way out of the city, Hesselina said, her voice urgent. Ioe Chen, it's not going to stop until we free Dead. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. The broadcast had gone out, but the battle was far from over. They had exposed the party's lies, but the Republic was vast, and the party's reach was long. They would need to disappear, to go underground, if they had any hope of surviving the aftermath. As they reached the end of the tunnel, the faint sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Chen's men were close. Too close. Lena's eyes darted around, searching for an exit. "Carried their carry," she whispered, pointing to a maintenance ladder leading up to the surface. Kai scrambled up first, his movements quick and frantic. Lena followed, dragging Ethan behind her. His vision was fading fast, the pain in his side becoming unbearable, but he couldn't stop. Now, not when they were so close. They reached the surface, emerging into the cold night air of New Haven. The city's neon lights flickered in the distance, but for now, they were safe. They had made it. Ethan collapsed against the wall of the alleyway, his breath ragged. Lena knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she pressed against the wound. "We did it," Ethan whispered, his voice barely a breath. "And we got the truth out." Lena nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Sab? Yeah, we did." Connor was already scanning the horizon, his fingers twitching as he pulled up a map of the city. "We need to move. Chensa is going to have the entire city locked down within the hour." Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of everything they had accomplished and everything that still lay ahead pressing down on him. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Ethan allowed himself a moment of peace. The lies had been exposed. The people would rise. The battle for freedom had just begun. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The hum of the city below felt distant and detached, as if the metropolis of towering skyscrapers and flashing neon lights wasn't teetering on the brink of collapse. Dr. Ethan Williams stood at the edge of his apartment's balcony, eyes scanning the streets filled with commuters, ordinary people living their lives, completely unaware that their thoughts, their choices, their very freedom had been stolen from them. Ethan took a deep breath, the cold night air chilling him to his bone. He glanced down at the encrypted tablet in his hands, the lines of code scrolling relentlessly across the screen. It was proof of everything he had feared. Proof that the Communist Party's grip on the populace extended far deeper than anyone could have imagined. Genetic manipulation, subtle, precise, and utterly insidious. With a few tweaks to the DNA sequence, they were able to influence the population's voting behavior without anyone ever knowing. "They've gone too far," he whispered to himself. "I helped create this, and now I have to destroy it." The door behind him slid open, and Ethan turned to see Samantha Leach standing in the doorway, arms crossed, a look of concern etched to her features. She was tall, with a determined presence that seemed to fill any room she entered. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her expression was one of controlled frustration. "You have been standing out here for hours," she said, stepping closer. "And then to say, I have to use time to waste up them. You need to act now." Ethan nodded, his mind heavy with guilt and responsibility. Samantha was right. The election was only days away, and the Communist Party's final phase of genetic control was about to be implemented. If they succeeded, the concept of free will in this nation would be nothing more than an illusion, a distant memory buried beneath layers of genetic programming. He glanced at Samantha. She had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went. She thought this was just another scandal, a corruption scheme by the party. But this was something far worse, something he couldn't explain fully without risking her life. She didn't know that she herself was immune to the genetic modifications, an anomaly he had discovered purely by chance. "I am going to need your help," Ethan finally said, his voice low. "But I can tell you everything just yet, not until I am sure." Samantha's eyes narrowed. "You don't trust me?" "It's not that," Ethan said quickly. "It's that I don't trust anyone. Not anymore. The party has its hands everywhere in everything. We have to be careful." Samantha studied him for a moment, her sharp mind weighing his word. Finally, she nodded. "Fine. But if we're going to expose them, we need more than just suspicions. We need hard evidence." Ethan smiled grimly. "I have more than evidence. I have the key to dismantling their entire operation. But first, we need to get to the central genetics facility. That's science where they're reholding the data on the final phase. Without it, we have nothing." Samantha's jaw tightened. "Its central facility is a fortress. You'll never get in." "I designed their security protocols," Ethan replied, his voice edged with both confidence and regret. "I can get us in." A tense silence hung between them before Samantha spoke again. "If we do this, there's no going back. You know that, right?" Ethan nodded, already aware of the weight of their decision. There would be no second chances. The moment they set foot inside the facility, they would be marked for death. General Varel, the party's enforcer, would make sure of that. "Then we better move fast," Samantha said, her voice steely. The streets were quiet as Ethan and Samantha made their way through the dimly lit alleyways, sticking to the shadows. The Central Genetics facility loomed in the distance, a massive structure of steel and glass that glowed faintly in the moonlight. It looked like a monument to progress, but inside it was nothing more than a factory for oppression. Ethan saw his pulse quickened as they approached the facility's entrance. His heart raced, knowing that the code he had written would be their only way in and their only hope of exposing the truth. "We will enter through the eastern side," Ethan whispered, crouching behind a dumpster as a patrol of guards passed by. "It's an old service door I installed when the building was first constructed. It's been decommissioned, but I can reactivate it with the code." Samantha nodded, her expression set with determination. "Let's, go." They moved swiftly and silently, reaching the service door without incident. Ethan pulled out his tablet, fingers moving expertly over the screen as he input the override code. The door clicked open with a soft hiss, and they slipped inside. The facility's interior was cold and sterile, the smell of disinfectant heavy in the air. Rows of servers hummed quietly, a digital heart of the party's genetic control program. Ethan led the way through the maze of corridors, every step calculated and precise. "We reclose," Ethan whispered, pointing to a door at the end of the hall. "The mainframe is in there. If we can access it, we can download the data we need." But as they approached the door, a familiar voice echoed from the shadow. Ethan froze. His blood ran cold as General Zeta stepped into the light, flanked by two heavily armed soldiers. Ida was tall and imposing, his eyes cold and calculating. He had the air of a man who had never known defeat, and he wasn't truly about to let Ethan change that. "You didn't really think you could walk in here unnoticed, did you?" Zafio asked, his voice dripping with contempt. "You know better than anyone that we see everything." Samantha moved to draw her weapon, but Zelma's soldiers were faster, aiming their rifles at her before she could make a move. Dantisaso said calmly, "You were outnumbered, and you were out of time." Ethan's mind raced. He had anticipated something like this, but not so soon. Not here. He glanced at the door to the mainframe, just a few steps away if he could get the data. They still had a chance. "What are you going to do?" Zato Ethan asked, trying to buy time. "Kill us. The world will find out what you've done. Eventually you can hide this forever." Zato chuckled. "You overestimate the world. Centrist in freedom, Dr. Williams' people want stability, they want safety, and we provide that. No one will mourn the loss of two more dissidents." Ethan clenched his fists, feeling the weight of his past decisions crashing down on him. He had helped build this system. He had thought he was doing something good, something that would benefit society. But now he saw the truth. It was nothing more than a cage. Samantha shot him a glance, her eyes filled with urgency. They had to act now. Before Atayo could speak again, Ethan lunged toward the door. In one fluid motion, he slammed his hand against the control panel, triggering the emergency override. The door slid open, and he and Samantha darted inside, bullets ricocheting off the walls behind them. Inside the mainframe room, Ethan wasted no time. He connected his tablet to the system, his fingers flying over the keys as he initiated the data transfer. Red warning lights flashed throughout the facility, the alarm blaring loudly in the distance. "We don't have much time," Ethan said, his voice tense. Samantha stood guard at the door, her weapon drawn. "How long?" 30 seconds, Ethan replied. "Just keep them off me." As the data downloaded, Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. They were so close. He could feel the weight of the truth in his hands, the knowledge that could bring the party and its rule crashing down. But then, a deafening explosion shook the facility and the power cut out. The room plunged into darkness and the hum of the servers abruptly ceased. Ethan's hands froze over the tablet, his mind racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. His contingency plan accounted for alarmed security teams and even Zawano himself, but not for a full system shutdown. Samantha's voice was sharp, tense. "What's happening?" "I don't know," Ethan muttered, panic bubbling in his chest. His tablet screen flickered, and the data transfer bar stalled at 90%. They must cut the power to the mainframe. They were trying to stop the download. Heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor outside, drawing closer by the second. Samantha's grip tightened around her weapon, and Ethan knew they had moments at best. Can you finish it? Samantha's eyes darted to the tablet, then back to the door. We're running out of time. I need a few more seconds. Ethan tapped furiously at the screen, overriding the security measures one by one. He could hear Zahosek's voice barking orders in the distance. The general was mobilizing more than just his personal guard now. He was bringing in reinforcement. This was it. If they didn't get the data now, they would never get another chance. Samantha moved toward the door, her posture rigid, listening for the advancing soldier. Ethan's heart pounded as the last 10% of the download crawled forward agonizingly slowly. A crackling sound suddenly filled the room, and the facility's emergency lights flickered to life, casting everything in a dull red glow. Ethan felt a surge of dread. The backup generators had kicked in, but not in time to stop the download. Done, Ethan snatched the tablet just as the transfer completed. He disconnected it from the terminal, shoving it into his bag. Reuven got it. But the moment of victory was short-lived. The door burst open with a deafening crash, and as soldiers stormed in, rifles raised. Samantha fired off 2 quick shots, taking down the first guard, but there were too many. She ducked behind a console, returning fire as the soldiers advanced. We have to go, Ethan shouted, adrenaline coursing through him. Samantha nodded, backing toward him while covering their exit. With one final burst of gunfire, they sprinted down the narrow corridor, the sound of Zao's men close behind. Ethan's side was racing, trying to map the best route out of the facility. They had to reach the eastern exit, the service door they had entered through, but Zaso would have it covered by now. They were cutting off our escape. Samantha called out as she fired behind them. We need another way. Ethan's eyes darted to the ceiling, the ventilation shafts. He shouted, we can crawl through them, come on. Samantha hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Ethan spotted a maintenance hatch at the end of the corridor and raced toward it. His hands fumbled as he worked the bolts loose, but the adrenaline sharpened his focus. Samantha stood guard, shooting at anything that moved in the shadows. Finally, the hatch popped open, and Ethan pulled himself up into the narrow shaft. Samantha followed close behind, pulling the hatch closed just as the soldiers turned the corner. They crawled through the cramped space, the air thick with the smell of dust and metal. This better lead somewhere, Samantha muttered, her voice tight with exertion. It will, Ethan said, though his confidence was starting to waver. The facility was massive, and he hadn't been inside in years. He wasn't sure this shaft still connected to the service exit. They crawled in silence for what felt like an eternity, their breaths labored and tense. The soldiers were below them, their voices muffled but audible. Boasao's booming commands echoed through the facility as he ordered a full lockdown. Ethan's stomach clenched. If they didn't get out soon, the entire place would be sealed off, and they'd be trapped like rats. Suddenly, the shaft widened and light filtered in through a metal grate up ahead. Ethan scrambled forward, peering through the slats. Below them was a deserted storage room filled with crates and old equipment. No guards, no alarm. This is it, he whispered, motioning for Samantha. We can drop down here and make our way out through the maintenance tunnel. Samantha nodded, and together they kicked the grate free, dropping down into the room below. The moment they hit the ground, they moved swiftly toward the far end, where a rusted door led to the underground tunnel. As they stepped through the door, the cool, damp air of the tunnel hit them. It was quiet here, too. Quiet, but Ethan wasn't about to question their good fortune. They hurried down the narrow path. Ethan, Serge, mind racing. They had the data. They could expose the party's genetic manipulation, but the real battle was just beginning. For Saya wouldn't he stop hunting them, and the party wouldn't he let this leak go public without a fight. Where do we go now? Samantha asked, her voice low but urgent. She kept her eyes scanning the darkness, ever vigilant. We need to get this information to the resistance, Ethan replied. Once we upload the data, the truth will spread like wildfire. The party won't be able to contain it. And what about Samantha's gaze flickered with uncertainty. He said, I'm not going to just let us walk away. Ethan's jaw tightened. I know, but we have to keep moving. The tunnel stretched on endlessly, and the weight of their mission pressed heavily on both of them. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Ethan allowed himself a moment to hope. They had the truth, the undeniable proof of the party, sell the manipulation. They could finally end the regimes had control over the people's sun wines, their very DNA. But as they neared the exit, the sound of footsteps echoed from ahead. "Get down," Samantha whispered, pulling Ethan behind a stack of old crates. They crouched low, waiting in silence as the footsteps grew louder. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline spiking once again. Through the dim light of the tunnel, Ethan saw them, two of Zio's soldiers, armed and alert. They moved slowly, methodically, sweeping the area as they advanced. Ethan held his breath, his mind racing for a plan. They couldn't tourette their way out, not without drawing more attention. Samantha reached into her bag, pulling out a small cylindrical device. She looked at Ethan and mouthed the word smoke. Ethan nodded, bracing himself. With a swift motion, Samantha tossed the device down the tunnel. It clattered against the ground, and within seconds, thick, white smoke billowed through the narrow space, obscuring everything. The soldiers shouted in confusion, their voices muffled by the dense fog. Now Samantha hissed. They sprinted down the tunnel, ducking under the cover of smoke. The soldiers fired blindly, but their shots went wide, and Ethan and Samantha made it to the exit. They burst through the door, emerging into the cold night air. For a moment, the silence was overwhelming. Ethan gasped for breath, his heart pounding in his ears. They had done it. They had escaped. But as the adrenaline began to fade, reality set in. They were still being hunted. The party wouldn't stop until they were silenced permanently. "We need to move," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. "We can't stay here." Samantha nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Where do we go?" "There's a safe house not far from here," Ethan replied. "It's well off the grid. We can lay low for a while, figure out our next move." They set off into the night, their footsteps silent against the pavement. The city stretched out before them, vast and indifferent. But now for the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. They had the proof, they had the truth, and now they had a chance to fight back. As they disappeared into the shadows, the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting a pale light on a city still unaware of the storm that was coming. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The galaxy was wide, and its rulers even wider in their reach. Under the blood-red banner of the Interstellar Communist Party (CPU), humanity had conquered star systems, subjugated planets, and crushed rebellions with impunity. Earth, once the cradle of human civilization, was now just another cog in the machine of empire. Alien species became resources to be exploited, their planets ravaged for mineral wealth, their cultures erased in the name of progress, but not everyone was blind to the atrocities. Daniel Grayson stood on a platform in one of Earth's bustling spaceports, his dark eyes scanning the crowd of supporters that had gathered for his speech. He could feel the weight of history on his shoulders. The people needed to hear the truth, but he knew the risk. He adjusted the microphone in front of him, cleared his throat, and took a deep breath. "Citizens of Earth," Daniel's voice rang out strong and clear. "We've been told for generations that the Interstellar Communist Party expanded across the stars for the good of humanity. That the alien planets we've taken were full of primitive savages, unworthy of the freedoms we cherish. But I stand before you today to tell you it's all a lie." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people exchanged worried glances, while others nodded in agreement, their eyes burning with the same indignation that filled Daniel's heart. The CP isn't liberating these planets, they're enslaving them, they were bleeding them dry of resources, committing atrocities in our name, all while keeping us in the dark. Entire civilizations have been wiped out so that the elite can live in luxury. As the murmurs grew louder, Daniel could feel the tension mounting. He knew the danger he was in. Anyone who dared speak against the regime was marked. But this was bigger than him. It was bigger than any one person. If he didn't stand up, who would? "I know what you're thinking," Daniel continued. "How can one man fight an empire? But we don't have to fight alone. The truth is our weapon, and if enough of us stand up, they can't silence us all." Suddenly, a loud pop echoed from the back of the crowd. For a moment, Daniel thought it was a malfunction in the sound system. But then he saw the figure fall. His heart raced as chaos erupted. The crowd surged, pushing and shoving in every direction. Another shot rang out, and this time, Daniel dove behind the podium, his breath quick and shallow. "You're here," a voice hissed next to him. Daniel turned to see Eva Lindstrom crouching beside him. The former SCP, the intelligence officer, had been lurking in the shadows for days, tracking his movement. Her face was hidden beneath a hood, but her cold blue eyes gleamed with an urgency that set Daniel on edge. "Come with me if you want to live," she said, grabbing his arm. Daniel hesitated for a split second before nodding. The crowd had devolved into chaos, and he knew staying would only get him killed. He allowed Eva to lead him through a narrow alleyway that wound behind the spaceport. The sounds of gunfire and shouting faded into the distance as they moved deeper into the city's underbelly. Eva didn't say a word until they reached the safety of an abandoned building. She pushed Daniel inside, locking the door behind them. "You're reckless," she said, her voice low but sharp. "They'll kill you if you keep speaking out in the open like that." "And what do you suggest I do? Stay silent?" Daniel shot back, wiping sweat from his brow. "People need to know the truth. They need to see what the SCP is doing to our galaxy." Eva sighed and leaned against the wall, crossing her arms. "Tara, you're brave, Grayson, but bravery isn't enough. You need more than just words if you're going to bring them down." Daniel narrowed his eyes, unsure of where she was going with it. "And what do you propose? Your former SCP. Why are you even helping me?" "Because I know things," Unlakashida said quietly. "I know things you don't, things that could destroy the SCP from the inside." Daniel stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. "For you, like what?" Eva's eyes flickered with something darker, a shadow from her past that she couldn't T-shape. "There's at a research facility," she said, lowering her voice, "on a planet called Verizets, one of the outer colonies. The SCP uses it to experiment on alien species to strip their planets of resources. It's a graveyard of civilizations they've all wiped out, and the proof you need to expose them is there." Daniel stared at her, his mind racing. If what she said was true, then this was exactly the break he needed. But it was also incredibly dangerous. The SCP didn't tolerate traitors, and if they caught him, he wouldn't live long enough to see his truth come to light. "And why should I trust you?" Daniel asked, his voice hardening. "Or for all I know, this could be a trap." Eva didn't flinch. "She don't need to pinch funny, Frey," she said. "Does she want to take down the SCP down to you? This is your chance. I can get you inside, but once we reach there, you will need to be prepared for what you find. It's worse than you can imagine." Daniel took a deep breath. His instinct screamed at him to be cautious, but something about Eva's demeanor told him she was sincere. This wasn't just about helping him. It was about redemption for her own sin. "All right," Daniel said, "finally, let's do it." Eva nodded, her expression unreadable. "How we leave at dawn." The journey to Veris took them deep into the outer colonies, where few dared to venture without permission from the SM. The planet itself was a bleak, lifeless rock, scarred by years of resource extraction and exploitation. As their small craft descended through the thick, murky atmosphere, Daniel felt a knot tighten his stomach. "This place looks like death," he muttered, gazing out at the barren landscape below. "That's because it is. Eva replied, "SCP didn't just strip the land. They exterminated the native species. We were standing on a mass grave." Daniel's heart sank as they touched down on the cracked surface. The air was heavy, thick with dust and the lingering stench of destruction. The sky overhead was a sickly yellow, and the once great forests of Verishes had long since been reduced to nothing more than ash. Eva led the way, her movements cautious but deliberate. The facility was located beneath the surface, hidden from prying eyes. They had to navigate through a series of tunnels and checkpoints, each more heavily guarded than the last. Daniel's pulse quickened as they passed through, his hand resting on the blaster at his side. One wrong move, and they'd be caught. Finally, they reached the heart of the facility, a massive underground chamber filled with rows upon rows of containment units. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he saw what was inside. The aliens weren't all just dead, they were being harvested. Their bodies had been mutilated, dissected, their organs extracted for use in the Scifiaudiobooks war machine. Some were still alive, trapped in a state of perpetual agony as their vital functions were sustained by cruel machines. "This is it," Eva whispered. "This is what they were hiding. This is what they were doing in the name of progress." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. He had expected horrors, but nothing like this. The reality of it all hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment he felt his resolve waver. Could he really take on something this monstrous? Could he really bring down an empire that thrived on such evil? "We have to expose this," Daniel said, his voice shaking. The galaxy needs to know." Eva nodded grimly. "There's a data terminal in the next room. If we can download the files, we'll have all the evidence we need. But we have to be fast. This place is crawling with surveillance. And if they find us..." Daniel didn't need her to finish the sentence. He knew what was at stake. Every second they spent here increased their chances of being caught, and the thought of what the SPP would do to them made his stomach churn. Still, he couldn't turn back now, not after seeing this. They moved swiftly, keeping to the shadows as they approached the control room. The sound of their footsteps was drowned out by the low hum of the machines keeping the alien prisoners alive, or barely alive in some cases. Daniel's hands were slick with sweat as he pulled out his blaster, ready for anything. The door to the control room slid open with a soft hiss, and they slipped inside. Eva went straight to the terminal, her fingers flying across the keys with practiced precision. Daniel kept his eyes on the door, heart racing. Every minute felt like an eternity. Finally, Eva let out a soft curse.
"Damn it, the files are encrypted. I need more time."
"How much more?" Daniel whispered, glancing nervously down the hallway. He could almost hear the heavy boots of SCP soldiers approaching, even though the facility remained eerily quiet. "Just a few more minutes," Eva replied, her voice strained. "Here, this encryption is state-of-the-art. They didn't want anyone to get their hands on them." Daniel swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. They had come too far to fail now. He tightened his grip on the blaster, ready for anything, but nothing could have prepared him for the sound that came next. A deep guttural growl echoed through the hallway. Daniel's blood ran cold. It wasn't the sound of soldiers. This was something else, something far worse. Eva froze, her eyes wide. "What is it?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "He must have released it," Eva said, her face pale temperature. "A creature from one of the alien species they've been experimenting on. A weapon. They don't keep it here unless they know someone's trying to steal something important." The growl grew louder, closer. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. "How do we stop it?" "We don't," Ada said, her hands shaking as she continued working on the terminal. "We run as soon as I get these files. We run." Daniel's cells quickened as the creature's footsteps echoed down the corridor. It was close now, too close. He could hear the heavy breathing, the scrape of claws against metal. The creature let out another growl, louder this time, and Daniel could feel the vibrations in the floor beneath his feet. "Got it," Leva exclaimed, yanking a data chip from the terminal. But before they could make a break for it, the creature appeared at the end of the hallway. It was massive, towering over them, its skin a mottled gray-green and its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. Its claws were razor-sharp, and its mouth was filled with rows of jagged teeth. Daniel raised his blaster, his hands trembling. But Eva grabbed his arm. "Don," she hissed. "That thing's designed to absorb energy. Blasters 1 heard it." "Then what the hell do we do?" Daniel asked, panic creeping into his voice. "Follow me," whispered, her eyes darting around the room. "There's a way out through the maintenance tunnels, but we have to be fast." They backed away slowly, keeping their eyes on the creature. It sniffed the air, its head swiveling toward them. Daniel's heart hard pounded in his chest as they edged toward the door. The creature let out a low snarl, and for a moment, Daniel thought they were done for. Then, without warning, it charged. Eva grabbed Daniel's arm and yanked him through the door just as the creature's saws slashed through the space where they had been standing. They sprinted down the hallway, the creature, hot on their heel. Daniel says, lungs burned as they ran, the sound of the creature's footsteps thundering behind them. "This way," Eva shouted, ducking into a side corridor. They rounded the corner, the creature crashing into the wall behind them, and bolted toward a hatch at the end of the hall. Eva slammed her fist against the panel, and the hatch slid open with a groan. They dove inside just as the creature lunged, its claws scraping against the metal as the hatch sealed shut. Daniel collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. "An abomination," Eva said, her voice grim. Charles, the CPC's idea of a perfect soldier. They take the strongest traits of the alien species they conquer and splice them together. What you just saw was the result. Jesus, Daniel muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. How many of those things are there? Too many, replied, her eyes dark, and they were using them to crush any planet that resists their rule. Daniel felt a surge of anger. But we have to get this out to the galaxy. People need to know what the ICP is doing. Evan nodded. We will, but first we have to get out of here alive. The maintenance tunnels were a maze of twisting passages and dead ends, but Ava seemed to know where she was going. They moved quickly, not daring to stop for too long. The creature's growls echoed faintly behind them, but it seemed they had managed to lose it for now. Once we were clear of this facility, we'll transmit the files to every resistance group in the galaxy, Kieleva said, as they hurried through the tunnel. It'll take time to reach everyone, but once the truth is out, the SCP-1 won't be able to hide anymore. And what happens then? Daniel asked, his voice tight with anxiety. Right, they'll come after us with everything they've got. Eva gave him a hard look. That's it, the price of revolution? Grayson, you wanted to take them down. This is how it started. They reached the exit, a small hatch at the far end of the tunnel that led to the surface. Eva glanced around, then gestured for Daniel to follow her. They climbed out into the barren landscape, the sky above them a dull gray. The air was thick with dust, but the oppressive atmosphere of the facility was behind them. Where's on a ship? Daniel asked, scanning the horizon. Over there, Emma said, pointing to a small outcrop of rocks in the distance. They made a break for it, sprinting across the cracked ground. Daniel's legs felt like lead, his body screaming for rest. But he pushed himself forward. The ship was their only chance of escape. As they neared the outcrop, Daniel's comlink buzzed. He glanced at it, his heart sinking. It was a message from one of his contacts on Earth. SCP forces are mobilizing. They know what you're up to. Get out now. They're onto us, Daniel said breathlessly. We need to move. Ava, didn't he need to be told twice? They reached the ship and scrambled aboard, the engines roaring to life as the hatch sealed behind them. Daniel collapsed into the pilot seat, his fingers flying over the control. The ship lifted off the ground, and they shot into the sky just as the alarms began blaring from the facility below. That was too close, Daniel muttered, his heart still racing. Eva leaned back in her seat, her expression unreadable. Freakered, it's not over yet. We've got the files, but getting them out to the galaxy won't be easy. DCP controls most of the communications networks. They'll need to find a way to broadcast the files without being intercepted. Daniel nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. Shiri will find a way. We have to. As the ship soared through the atmosphere, leaving the desolate planet of Varys behind, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The truth was out there now, but it would take more than just words to bring down the Empire. The fight for freedom had begun, and there was no turning back. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The morning sunlight filtered through the city, thick haze, casting long shadows on the streets of New York City. John Archer stood on the balcony of his campaign headquarters looking out over the skyline, a mixture of determination and unease coursing through him. The election was only days away, but something felt wrong. For weeks, he then noticed a strange shift in the behavior of voters. Once passionate supporters of the opposition seemed to have forgotten key elements of his campaign, or worse, seemed to have forgotten his campaign entirely. John, a voice called from behind. He turned to see Laura Green, his chief campaign strategist and closest confidant. Her sharp eyes were narrowed, scanning his face for any sign of doubt. You still thinking about it? She asked, stepping up beside him. We ran over the data a dozen times. It doesn't make sense. Something is happening out there. John nodded grimly. I can feel it. Laura, voters are acting like they don't remember half of what we've done. They're forgetting things about the opposition, our policies, the entire race. It's like they've had their memories wiped clean. Laura frowned, leaning on the railing. It's none of it. Besides, not just paranoia, John. I've seen it too there, so a pattern something bigger than us is at play. Before he could respond, John's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. Hesitating for a moment, he answered, "Mr. Archer, if you want the truth, meet me at the corner of 12th and Broadway alone. No one can know. You have 1 hour." The voice was calm, cold, and unmistakably artificial before he could ask who it was. The line went dead. John stared at the phone, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" Laura asked, her concern deepening. Something strange," he muttered. "It you go alone." "Alone?" Laura shot him a sharp look. "Well, he's sure that says it. Good idea." John was already moving, grabbing his coat from the chair and heading for the door. "I'll call you if I need anything, Ira," he said over his shoulder, his heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and fear. An hour later, John stood at the bustling corner of 12th and Broadway, the city swirling around him in a blur of noise and movement. He scanned the crowd, unsure of who he was waiting for. Then, from the shadows of a nearby alley, a figure stepped forward. The man was short, unassuming, with a hood pulled low over his face. He moved with a strange, calculated precision, as though every step was part of a larger plan. "You Archer," the man said flatly. It wasn't TA. Question. John nodded, sizing the stranger up. "Who are you?" "That's not important." The man replied, "You're what matters, is what I know. There's a secret program the government's been running for years. They call it memory reset, because they rewriting the memories of the voters, making them forget everything about you and the opposition." John's heart skipped a beat. "That size impossible," he muttered, though the chill was already spreading through him. "Is it the man's voice was like, I see you. You've seen the signs, haven't you? Your supporters suddenly forgetting key parts of your platform. Opposition members who can remember the other candidates at Sci-Fi, part of the plan. They wipe the slate clean, make sure no one remembers anything except the ruling party." John's mind raced. How is that even possible? No take. The man said they've embedded it into the device's phones, computers, every screen. People look at it. It sends signals directly into the brain, selectively erasing and rewriting memory. It's subtle, undetectable, but it's happening right under your nose. John clenched his fists. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I am tired of being a part of it." The man replied, his voice filled with a quiet bitterness. "I helped build the system. I know how it works, but I didn't sign up to control people's minds. There's no democracy left, no choice. It's all a facade." John stared at him, disbelief and anger warring inside him. "Serious, if this is true, why don't you go public? Expose them." The man shook his head. "You don't even understand. They control everything, every media outlet, every channel of communication. If I speak up, I disappear. The only reason I am telling you this is because you have a chance. You running for office. You still have a platform. But you need to act fast." They were planning a full reset before Election Day. By the time the votes are cast, no one will even remember you were in the race. John felt the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. Everything made sense. Now the strange behaviors, the forgotten promises, the blank stares from people who once stood by him. The government wasn't just corrupt. They were rewriting reality. "What do I need to do?" he asked, his voice hardening. The man reached into his coat, pulling out a small device. This is a jammer. It can block the signals, keep your memories safe, but it only works for a small group. If you want to stop the reset, you will need to take out the central hub. The servers are hidden in a secure government facility. You get in there, you can shut it down. John took the device, a heavy sense of purpose settling over him. Tariq was at the facility. The man hesitated. "I'll send you the details, but be careful. They were watching you. Now one wrong move and you'll be wiped like everyone else." With that, the man disappeared back into the crowd, leaving John standing alone, gripping the jammer in his hand. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but one thing was clear: if he didn't act, everything he fought for would be erased from history. Back at campaign headquarters, John gathered his most trusted advisors, Laura Marcus, a tech genius with a knack for hacking government systems, and Rachel, a former intelligence officer who joined John's campaign out of a sense of duty to protect democracy. He explained everything the stranger had told him. The room fell into a stunned silence as the weight of the revelation sunk in. Marcus said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Citizens, it makes sense," Rachel interjected, her brow furrowed. He may have even heard rumors about government tech projects, but I never imagined it was this advanced. If they were controlling memories, then the entire election is a show. John nodded, his face grim. We don't have much time. The reset is happening before Election Day. If we don't stop them, everything will be lost. Laura looked at him, her expression hardening with resolve. Prior, what's the plan? John took a deep breath, laying out the strategy. Curate, we need to break into the facility where they were running the memory reset program. It's heavily guarded, but Marcus can hack the security system. Rachel, you will lead the infiltration team once inside. We'll plant a virus in their servers and shut the whole thing down. The room buzzed with tension as they prepared for what was undoubtedly the most dangerous mission any of them had ever faced. But there was no turning back. If they failed, democracy would die with them. The night before the operation, John stood alone in his office, staring at the flickering city lights outside. His mind drifted to the millions of people who were completely unaware of the battle being waged for their freedom. They lived their lives, worked their jobs, loved their families, all while their memories were being manipulated by unseen hands. For a moment, doubt crept in. Could they really pull this off? Was it even possible to fight against a system so deeply entrenched in the machinery of power? But then he thought of the stranger words if they were planning a full reset before Election Day. If he did nothing, everything would be erased. His campaign, his fight for justice, the hope of a free election, it would all vanish, as if it had never existed. He couldn't let that happen. The next evening, the resistance gathered at a safe house on the outskirts of the city. The mood was tense but determined. Each member of the team knew what was at stake, and each had made their peace with the possibility that they might not make it out alive. Marcus worked quickly, hacking into the government's security systems and providing them with real-time data on the guards and surveillance cameras surrounding the facility. Rachel led the infiltration team, her military training kicking in as they moved with precision and silence. John stayed close, his heart pounding in his chest as they approached the facility's outer wall. His mind raced through the plan again and again, searching for any potential flaws. They couldn't afford mistakes, not tonight. As they reached the outer perimeter of the facility, John crouched low, behind a concrete barrier, his eyes scanning the entrance. The high-security government building loomed before them, a fortress of glass and steel nestled among the shadows of the city. Rachel motioned silently for the team to move forward, and they obeyed with military precision, each step calculated, each movement silent. Marcus's voice crackled softly in their earpieces. I've disabled the exterior camera. You've got a 5-minute window before they switch to manual override. John's and his heart raced as they crept toward the security gate. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the faint hum of the facility. Set in power generator. They reached the gate, and Rachel deftly cut through the electronic lock with a small device she had brought. The gate slid open without a sound, and the team slipped inside. Once past the gate, they moved swiftly through the inner courtyard, sticking to the shadow. The facility's main entrance was up ahead, guarded by 2 armed soldiers. Rachel held up a hand, signaling the team to stop. She signaled to David, one of the volunteers trained in combat, to take the lead. David nodded, pulling out a small, non-lethal tranquilizer dart gun with 2 quick shots. The guards dropped silently to the ground. Rachel motioned for the group to continue. They reached the door, and Marcus, working from his remote location, unlocked it for them. The door hissed open, revealing a long corridor bathed in sterile fluorescent light. And Rachel whispered into her comm. Good, Marcus responded. You need to head to the server room. 3rd floor, northwest wing. I am sending the building layout to your tablets now. You will need to hurry. I can only keep the alarm systems offline for so long. John followed Rachel through the corridor, the rest of the team close behind. His heart thudded in his chest with each step, the gravity of the mission sinking deeper into his bone. This was it, the moment they either saved the election or lost everything. They reached the stairwell and quickly ascended to the 3rd floor. The hallways were eerily empty, the hum of servers and machinery the only sound. John gripped the jammer in his hand, feeling its weight as they approached the northwest wing. Marcus guided them through the maze of corridors, his voice steady in their ears. Take a left here now, down the hall. There should be a door on your right. That's on the server room. Rachel reached the door first, checking for any signs of additional security. Looks clear, she said, though her tone was cautious. Let's move. Inside the server room was a massive chamber filled with rows upon rows of humming machinery. Towering columns of hardware stretched to the ceiling, the heart of the memory reset program. In the center of the room stood a raised platform where the main control console blinked with lights. It was all too easy. "We've got to act fast," Marcus's voice urged. "Once you start uploading the virus, they were going to know something as strong." Rachel approached the control console, quickly plugging in the drive that Marcus had prepared. "I am starting the upload," she said, her fingers flying across the key. The screen flickered as the virus began its work, infiltrating the central memory control system. John watched, feeling the tension rise with each passing second. His fingers tightened around the jammer in his hand, his nerves on edge. A loud alarm suddenly blared through the facility, piercing the silence. Red lights flashed as the entire building went into lockdown. John's pulse quickened. "They were onto us." Marcus's voice came through urgently. "Securities have been triggered. You've got maybe 3 minutes before they reach you." Rachel's eyes darted to the door. "We have 3 minutes." John turned toward the door as the heavy footfalls of armed guards echoed down the corridor. There was no time to think, only time to act. He moved quickly, pushing one of the massive server racks in front of the door to block their entrance. It wouldn't hurt to hold them for long, but it would buy them a few precious seconds. "Keep the upload going," John shouted over the blaring alarm, adrenaline surging through him. Rachel nodded, her focus unbroken as she worked furiously on the console. The virus was spreading through the system, but it wasn't moving fast enough. The guards outside pounded on the door, their shouts growing louder. Any second now, they would break through. 30 seconds, Marcus shouted in their ears. "The virus needs 30 more seconds." The door shook violently as the guards tried to force it open. John's breath came in, rapid bursts, as he held his ground, bracing against the server rack. It wasn't going to hold much longer. He glanced at Rachel, who was laser-focused on the console. Come on, she muttered, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The door burst open with a deafening crash. Armed guards stormed into the room, their weapons raised. John ducked behind the server rack as bullets ricocheted off the metal columns, sparks flying. Rachel crouched low behind the console, her hands still on the keyboard. The upload bar inched closer to completion, just a few more seconds. John's heart pounded as he pulled the jammer from his belt. There was no other option. He had to disable the guards long enough to give Rachel the time she needed. Without hesitation, he activated the jammer, sending out a pulse that disrupted the nanotech controlling the guards' memory. The effect was immediate. Confusion spread across their faces as they lowered their weapons, momentarily dazed. "Now," John shouted. Rachel hit the final key and the screen flashed green. The virus had fully uploaded. The memory reset system was down. "We did it," she breathed, her voice shaky with relief. But their victory was short-lived. More guards were flooding into the hallway, and they were out of time. "Fall back," Rachel yelled. John grabbed the jammer and bolted for the door, the rest of the team following close behind. They sprinted down the corridor, dodging bullets as they made their escape. Behind them, the server room erupted in chaos as the virus continued to dismantle the memory control system, sending shockwaves through the facility. They reached the stairwell, and John glanced back one last time. The sounds of shouting and gunfire echoed through the building, but they had done it. The memory reset was broken. They burst through the front entrance and out into the night, the cool air hitting them like a wave of relief. The mission was over, but the battle was far from won. The next morning, the city was buzzing with the news across the country. People were waking up from the mental fog that had clouded their memories for so long. John stood in his office, watching the headlines flash across the newsfeed. Citizens were remembering the opposition, remembering his campaign, remembering everything that had been taken from them. He had done it. He had given them their memories back. But even as the wave of relief washed over him, John knew the fight was far from over. The government would not go down without a fight. They had lost control of the election, but they still held power, and now they were more dangerous than ever. Laura entered the office, her face pale but determined. "The people are rallying," she said. "They were demanding a fair election, but the government isn't backing down. We need to be ready for whatever comes next." John nodded, his gaze still fixed on the screen. "Whoever won the first battle," he said quietly, "but the war is just beginning." He turned to Laura, his expression hardened with resolve. "Get the team together. We were going to finish this." And so the fight for freedom continued. But now, with the truth finally revealed, John knew they had a chance. The people had their memories back, and with them, the power to change the future. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, there was hope. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The morning air was crisp as Ethan Cole stepped onto the small stage, the wooden planks creaking slightly beneath his feet. It was a modest setup, just a single podium and a few banners with his campaign logo flapping in the light breeze. The crowd before him was sparse but eager, a mixture of middle-aged workers, students, and young families holding hastily made signs of support. Ethan straightened his tie and adjusted his jacket, taking a deep breath. This was it, the moment he had been working toward for months. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "I am Ethan Cole, and I am running for office because our democracy deserves better." A few cheers rang out, though the response was quieter than usual. Ethan couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been creeping in over the last few weeks. His campaign, once filled with energy and momentum, seemed to be slowing. There had been fewer mentions of his name in the news, less engagement on social media. At first, he chalked it up to the usual ebb and flow of political races. But as the days went by, he realized something more insidious was happening. He pressed on, delivering his speech with passion. He talked about government corruption, about the importance of transparency, about giving a voice to the voiceless. Yet, as he scanned the faces in the audience, a strange sensation crept up his spine. People were listening, but there was a distance, as if he were speaking through a fog. After the rally, Ethan returned to his campaign headquarters, a small office crammed with volunteers and makeshift desks. His campaign manager, Lily, greeted him with a concerned look. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had been with him since the beginning, her dedication unwavering. "Not bad, right?" Ethan asked, hoping for some reassurance. Lily hesitated before answering. "Yeah, you were great, but we need to talk." She led him to the back of the office where they could have some privacy. Ethan frowned, sensing something was off. "What's going on?" he asked, lowering his voice. Lily handed him a tablet. "Take a look." Ethan swiped through the screen, scanning the headlines from major news outlets. His heart sank. Not a single mention of his rally. No photos, no quotes, nothing. It was as if the event had never happened. "That sounds impossible," Ethan muttered. "We had press there. I saw them." Lily crossed her arms, her brow furrowed. "They were there, but it's South like they don't even remember it. And it's not just this rally. All our coverage has been dropping off over the last few weeks. We're being erased, Ethan." The word erased hit him hard. He slumped into a chair, running a hand through his hair. "But why? We haven't done anything illegal. We were just pushing for change." Lily leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "I think it's something bigger than that. This isn't just political games. I've been hearing rumors about tech being used to silence opposition, something about making people invisible." Ethan's pulse quickened, invisible like censorship. "Worse," Lily said. "Is a scientist. She used to work for the government. She claims they've developed a way to make people disappear, not just physically, but digitally and psychologically, like they never existed." Ethan stared at her, disbelief warring with a creeping sense of dread. "That's insane." But it's happening," Lily insisted, "and it's happening to us." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to process what she was saying. Could this be true? Could the government really have the power to make him disappear, not just from the media, but from the collective memory of the public? He thought about the dwindling crowds, the lack of attention, the sudden drop in online support. It was as if his entire campaign had been slowly fading into the background, slipping away from reality. "Who sent this scientist?" he asked finally. "Can she help us?" Lily glanced around the room, as if expecting someone to be listening. "Her name is Rachel Wynn. She's sent underground now, hiding from the people who want her dead. But if anyone knows how to stop this, it's sent her." Ethan's mind raced. He had always suspected corruption in the government, but this was something else entirely. If what Lily was saying was true, then the entire election was a sham controlled by an unseen force with the power to eliminate its enemies without leaving a trace. "We have to find her," Ethan said, standing up before it sounded too late. 2 days later, Ethan found himself standing in the shadow of an old, dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of town. The address Lily had given him seemed abandoned, with rusted metal doors and broken windows, but this was where Rachel Wynne had told him to meet her. He glanced around, pulling his jacket tighter against the cold before knocking on the door. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then a small slit in the door slid open, revealing a pair of sharp eyes. "Ethan Cole," a voice asked. "Yes," Ethan replied, his heart pounding. The door creaked open and a woman stepped into view. She was younger than he had expected, with dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail and a no-nonsense expression. Her clothes were plain practical, a stark contrast to the high-tech gadgets strapped to her belt. "Come in," she said, glancing around nervously, quickly. Ethan followed her inside, the door clanging shut behind them. The interior of the warehouse was cluttered with old machinery and tools, but in the center was a makeshift lab, complete with computers, monitors, and strange devices Ethan couldn't begin to understand. Rachel Wynne turned to face him, her arms crossed. "I don't know how much you've been told, but I'm gonna give it to you straight. The government is using advanced cloaking technology to make people disappear. And by disappear, I mean they're re-erasing them from existence. Physically, mentally, digitally. It's like they never existed. That's what's happening to you, Ethan." Ethan swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "Why me?" "Because you read a threat," Rachel said bluntly. "Your campaign is gaining traction, and the people behind this election can't afford to let someone like you disrupt their control. So they've made you invisible. Your speeches aren't being broadcast. Your face isn't showing up on social media, and people are forgetting who you are. They were doing the same to your supporters." Ethan stared at her, trying to wrap his mind around the enormity of what she was saying. How do I stop it? Rachel hesitated, then gestured to one of the devices on her workbench. "I've been working on a way to reverse the invisibility. It's not perfect, but it could give you a window, a short period of time where you will be visible again, long enough to make an impact." Ethan approached the device, a sleek black box with wires snaking out of it. "What does it do?" "It emits a counter frequency that disrupts the cloaking field," Rachel explained. "But it's risky. The technology is still unstable. You could get hurt or worse." Ethan nodded slowly, his mind racing with possibilities. This was his chance, his only chance to fight back. If he could use this device to expose the truth, to show the world what was happening, then maybe, just maybe, he could turn the tide. "I'll do it," he said firmly, "whatever it takes." Rachel nodded, her expression grim. "We'll need to be careful. Once you activate this, they'll know you onto them, and they won't stop until you're gone, for good." Ethan met her gaze, his resolve hardening. "I am ready." The night of the final debate arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. Ethan stood backstage watching as Governor Julian Knox made his way to the podium, his polished smile never faltering. Knox was the perfect puppet, a charismatic figurehead who spoke of unity and progress, while the shadow government pulled the strings behind the scenes. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced at the device hidden beneath his jacket. This was it, his moment to expose the truth, to reveal the invisible hand manipulating the election. As the moderator introduced the candidates, Ethan stepped onto the stage, his hands trembling slightly. He could feel the weight of the device pressing against his side, a constant reminder of the danger he was about to face. Governor Knox smiled at him, but there was something cold in his eyes, a smug confidence that made Ethan's skin crawl. "Mr. Cole," Knox said smoothly, "I must say it's an honor to share this stage with you, though I am afraid your campaign has been rather quiet lately." Ethan gritted his teeth, refusing to rise to the bait. He took his place behind the podium, his mind racing with the plan Rachel had outlined. He had to time it perfectly. One wrong move, and everything would be lost. The debate began, and for the first few minutes, everything proceeded as usual. Knox gave his polished answers, deflecting tough questions with ease while Ethan struggled to make himself heard. It was happening again, the invisibility, the slow erasure of his presence. But then, as Knox launched into yet another rehearsed speech, Ethan reached beneath his jacket and activated the device. There was a soft hum, and for a split second, everything seemed to freeze. The audience gasped. Ethan glanced around, his heart racing. At first, nothing seemed to have changed. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw them, figures materializing out of thin air, stepping onto the stage as if emerging from the shadow. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the figures fully appeared, their faces slowly coming into focus under the harsh stage light. They were men and women dressed in suits and formal attire, politicians, journalists, and activists who had vanished from public life without explanation. He recognized several of them immediately, their faces once familiar from headlines and rallies, now pale and gaunt from their time in invisibility. It was as if ghosts had stepped out of the shadows, reclaiming their place in the world. The audience erupted into murmurs, confusion, spreading through the room like wildfire. Cameras panned wildly across the stage, trying to capture the impossible. The debate moderator stammered, completely thrown off script. Ethan Self's pulse raced. The device was working. For a split second, Governor Knox faltered, his polished demeanor slipped, his eyes widening as he looked at the newly visible figure. But he quickly recovered, turning to Ethan with a cold, forced smile. "What is this?" Knox asked, his voice tight. Some kind of trick. Ethan's fingers gripped the edge of the podium, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This isn't a trick. This is the truth. These people were erased by the fairy government that's been controlling this election by not. These people were made invisible, so they couldn't speak, couldn't fight back, but they're in here now, and the world will know." A few of the reappeared figures moved closer to Ethan, some of them still disoriented, as if they weren't sure whether they were truly seen. One woman, an older gray-haired activist Ethan recognized, stepped forward, tears in her eyes as she reached out to touch her own face, marveling at her return to visibility. "I was gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but the microphones caught it. "I thought I would never be seen again." The murmurs from the audience turned into an uproar, some people standing, others shouting questions. The cameras zoomed in, broadcasting every word, every movement. The invisible were now unmistakably visible, and the world was watching. Knox clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing as he took a step toward Ethan, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know what you were doing, Cole. You were playing with fire. You have no idea the forces you were up against." Ethan stared him down, the weight of everything finally hitting him. Now came the real danger. Knox wasn't just a corrupt politician. He was a puppet of something far larger, a shadow government with the power to erase anyone who posed a threat to their control. Oh, the exposure had only just begun, and they would come for him now, harder than ever before. But Ethan wasn't backing down. "You can't hide this anymore," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "People are waking up, they see what you've done, they'll demand answers, and they cut back their government." Knox's eyes glinted with something dark, fear, perhaps, but also anger. For the first time, he wasn't in control. The stage, the cameras, the audience, they were all slipping from his grasp. He turned sharply toward his security detail, barking orders under his breath. But before they could react, the sound of heavy boots echoed through the auditorium. Armed men in black tactical gear burst into the hall, their weapons drawn, and the crowd screamed, pushing toward the exit. Panic surged through the room. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. They were coming for him. Rachel had warned him. The moment he activated the device, they would know. The shadow government would let this exposure stand. They couldn't. The armed men moved quickly, pushing through the crowd with brutal efficiency, their eyes locked on Ethan. He felt a hand grab his arm. Rachel. She had appeared out of the wings, her face pale but determined. "We have to go now," she hissed, pulling him toward the side exit. "They were here to take you down." Ethan hesitated, glancing back at the stage where the reappeared figures stood, confused and afraid. "We can just leave them," he protested. Rachel shook her head, her grip tightening. "We can't help them if we Did Ethan? If they get you, everything you've done will be for nothing. We need to get to a secure location, get this podcast out to more people." Ethan's mind raced. The truth was out there now, but it wasn't high enough. They had to do more than just reveal the invisible people. They had to dismantle the entire system behind it. He nodded, following Rachel as they slipped out of the side door just as the armed men reached the stage. The air outside was cold and biting as they raced down the alley, their footsteps echoing off the brick wall. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline surging through him. This wasn't over. They had exposed the conspiracy, but the shadow government would come back harder, more violently than before. They had to act fast. Rachel led him to a waiting car, and they jumped inside. She threw the car into gear, speeding away from the building as the chaos of the debate hall faded into the distance. Ethan slumped back in his seat, his mind racing. "We need to get this footage to the right people," Rachel said, her eyes focused on the road ahead. They'll try to spin it as a hoax. Say it's sign fake, but if we can get this out fast enough, we'll force them into the light. Ethan nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. Knox's words kept echoing in his mind. You don't know what you were up against. The shadow government wasn't just a small group of corrupt officials. It was something much larger, much deeper, and now he was their target. Hours passed in a blur as they drove through the night, changing cars twice to throw off any pursuit. Finally, Rachel pulled into the underground parking garage of a nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. They hurried inside, taking a service elevator up to a small secure apartment that Rachel had set up as a safe house. Ethan collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion finally catching up with him. What now? He asked, rubbing his eye. Rachel sat across from him, her expression grim. Now we wait. I've sent the footage to every independent journalist and media outlet I trust. It's only a matter of time before the story breaks wide open. Ethan nodded, though unease gnawed at him. This felt too easy. The shadow government wouldn't just let them expose this without a fight. And sure enough, as the first rays of dawn filtered through the windows, the breaking news alerts started to flood in. Breaking opposition candidate Ethan Cole exposes government conspiracy. Is this the end of the election as we know it? Invisible no more. Dozens of political figures reappear during live debate. The headlines were everywhere, but with them came the backlash. Government spokespeople immediately denounced the footage as a hoax, calling it an elaborate deepfake designed to sow chaos in the election. Knox appeared on national television, calm and collected, dismissing the reappeared figures as political operatives hired to create confusion. This is the work of desperate people, Knox said, his voice dripping with condescension. They know they can, so they resort to these kinds of tactics. But the American people are smarter than that. We won, to be fooled. Ethan's stomach twisted. The lies were coming thick and fast, and people were already starting to believe them. The shadow government had deep roots, and they controlled more than just elections. They controlled the narrative itself. Rachel paced the room, her face tight with worry. We need something more. We need undeniable proof that this technology exists, that it's being used right now. Ethan looked up at her, a sinking feeling settling in his chest. How do we do that? Rachel stopped pacing, her eyes locking onto his. There's only one place where we can find the evidence we need. The lab where they developed the invisibility technology. If we can get in there and steal the data, we can expose them once and for all. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. You know where it is. Rachel nodded slowly. I do, but it's centrally guarded. If we go in there, there's no guarantee we'll come out. Ethan stood up, his jaw set. We don't have a choice. If we don't try to do this, they'll bury the truth again, and more people will disappear. Rachel hesitated for a moment, then nodded. All right, so finish this. Together, they left the safe house, the weight of what they were about to do hanging heavily in the air. This was their last chance. They would either expose the truth and take down the shadow government, or they would disappear, just like the others. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The crowd was small but fierce. A group of rebels in their own right clustered together under the dim streetlights of a crumbling city. Alexander Lee stood before them, his voice rising above the wind that swept through the hollow alleyways, carrying with it the scent of decay that clung to the city for too long. The truth will be revealed, Alexander said, his voice firm but warm. He had been fighting this fight for years, and every day felt like a losing battle. This regime has thrived on secrecy, on manipulation, on holding on to power for lifetime. But the time has come for us to expose them for what they really are. His words struck a chord with the audience. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but there was fear in their eyes. The Communist Party had ruled with an iron fist for more than a century, using technology so advanced it bordered on the mystical. Whispers of life extension technology had circulated in underground circles, but nothing had ever been proven until now. Dr. Mia Bahatio, standing behind Alexander, pulled her coat tighter around her slender frame. She had once been a key scientist in the government. The Life Extension Project, a project that had gone far beyond what the public could imagine. She knew the technology intimately, knew how it worked, and more importantly, how it was used to control the highest echelons of the party. As the crowd dispersed, wary of attracting too much attention from the ever-present surveillance drones, Mina stepped forward. They'll come for us. You know, you want to be able to hide once this information gets out. She warned Alexander quietly, her eyes scanning the darkened horizon as if she could sense the invisible threat looming. "They've then been coming for me since the moment I stood against them," Alexander replied, his tone resolute. "But this is bigger than us. The people deserve to know." I handed him a small data chip. It was innocuous enough to pass through checkpoints undetected, but it held the key to unraveling the party's darkest secret. Alexander looked at it, knowing that with this, he was holding the regime's downfall in his hand. He had a choice to make go public with the evidence and risk everything or continue the fight from the shadow. "Once you release this, I continued, her voice low, "there's no turning back." Alexander didn't hesitate. There never was. The decision had been made tomorrow. During the nationally broadcast political debate between him and Chairman Fang, the truth would come to light. The next day, the atmosphere was tense. Across the city, massive holographic billboards broadcasted the debate, and people gathered in squares, bars, and living rooms to watch the showdown. Alexander stood in a quiet room backstage, pacing. Elena Chang, his campaign strategist and the sharpest mind in his team, approached him. "We've only got one shot at this," she reminded him, her voice steady, though the weight of their mission hung heavy between them. "Once you confront Feng, we need to be ready to go live with the data. If we don't act fast, the party will shut it down before the public sees it." Alexander stopped pacing and faced her. "Is everything ready on your end?" Elena nodded. "The hackers are in place. We've got journalists ready to spread the story through every underground channel we can find. Even if they cut us off, the truth will get out." But she paused, glancing at me. I who stood in the corner, her expression grim. "We might not all make it out of this alive." IS eyes met Alexander S. She had known this moment was inevitable from the day she defected. "The party doesn't forgive betrayal, but I've made my choice." They all had the risk of death was real, but it was a risk worth taking. The debate was held in the heart of the capital, a sprawling futuristic building that loomed over the rest of the city. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation as the audience, comprised of government officials, loyalists, and select citizens, took their seat. The party's grip on the media was evident in the carefully curated crowd. Everyone present was either a known supporter or too afraid to resist. Alexander Sanders stood at his podium facing Chairman Fang, the man who had ruled the nation for more than a century. Fang's appearance was startling. He looked no older than 50, his face unlined, his eyes sharp and calculating. The rumors about his immortality, once dismissed as conspiracy theories, seemed more real than ever as Alexander studied him up close. Fang's voice was calm and controlled, but beneath the surface, there was an unmistakable aura of arrogance. "You claim to stand for the people, Mr. Liu, yet all you offer is chaos and rebellion. The Communist Party has brought stability, progress, and peace to this nation. What you offer is nothing more than a return to the dark days of unrest." Alexander Dan knew this moment was pivotal. The crowd, the nation, the world was watching. He took a breath, steeling himself. "What I offer," he began, his voice steady, "is the truth." A murmur went through the crowd, but Feng remained composed. "The truth, you say? And what truth is that?" "The truth," Alexander said, "is that the Communist Party has held onto power for over a century through technology that should never have existed. Life extension technology used by the party's elite to keep themselves in power indefinitely, while the rest of the country suffers under their tyranny." There was a sharp intake of breath from the audience. Fanny's eyes narrowed and a cold smile tugged at his lip. "These are dangerous accusations, Mr. Lika, unfounded and frankly absurd." Alexander didn't waver. He glanced at Elena, who gave him a subtle nod from the audience. "It was time. I have proof," he declared. "Dr. Maibara Fata, a former scientist for the regime, has provided irrefutable evidence of the party's use of life extension technology. And right now, my team is broadcasting that evidence to the entire nation." Chairman Fang's composure cracked for the first time. He signaled to his security, but it was too late. Across the nation, the broadcast was hijacked, screens flickered, and the pre-recorded testimony of Dr. Iva Hara appeared. Her voice, calm but filled with regret, echoed through every public space. "For decades, I worked on a secret project to develop life extension technology for the Communist Party," she said, her face illuminated on the screen. "What started as a scientific endeavor to extend human life became a tool of control used by the party as elite to remain in power, unchallenged and unaged, while the rest of the population is kept in the dark. The reaction was immediate in the streets. People stopped in their tracks, staring at the screens in disbelief. The truth had been laid bare, and the air was electric with the possibility of rebellion. In the debate hall, chaos erupted. Fenian security forces moved in, but Alexander's supporters were ready. Protesters outside surged forward, clashing with police, and the hall itself became a battleground. Amid the chaos, Alexander rocked eyes with Fengmi. "This is the end of your reign," he said quietly, but with steel in his voice. Feng's expression hardened. "You have no idea what you've had done." Outside, the city was on fire, both metaphorically and literally. The protests that had started as small, isolated pockets of resistance had exploded into full-blown riot. People who had once feared the party, Sein power, were now emboldened by the revelation, willing to fight for their freedom. Elena coordinated from a hidden command center, monitoring the situation. We were losing control," she muttered, watching the screens as police and military forces began to crack down on the protesters with brutal efficiency. Leitaguri, a loyalist embedded in Alexander Sein's campaign, watched the chaos unfold. He had been sent by the party to infiltrate the opposition, but as the days had gone by, he found himself questioning his mission. He had seen the corruption, the abuse of power, but more than that, he had seen the hope in the eyes of people who wanted change. Now, watching the regime crush its own citizens, Lun knew he had a choice to make. He could continue to serve the party, or he could join the fight for something better. With a deep breath, he made his decision. Lagway moved quickly through the chaos, weaving between protesters and riot police, the air thick with the acrid smell of tear gas. His heart pounded in his chest as he weighed his next move. He had been loyal to the party for as long as he could remember. But the truth, the ugly, undeniable truth, had shattered his conviction. He couldn't unsee the corruption, the manipulation, the centuries-long control of power that had oppressed the people. The party had promised stability, but it had given them a dictatorship masquerading as peace. His orders had been clear: infiltrate Alexander Ryuishi campaign, gain their trust, and report back on their every move. But now, as he stood at the crossroads of loyalty and morality, he realized that his orders were irrelevant. He could no longer serve a regime built on lies. He pulled out his communicator, hesitating for only a second before activating a secure line to Alexander's team. Elena's voice crackled through. "Who is this?" I am switching side." There was a brief silence on the other end, then Elena's sharp voice cut through. "We don't have time for games." "No games. I have intel on the party CO, plans to suppress the uprising. Let me help." There was another pause, but shorter this time. "Meet me at the safe house on Exing Road. You'd better be telling the truth." Lalawi shoved the communicator into his pocket and began moving toward the safe house, aware that he was now a target for both sides. He had just made himself a traitor to the party, but for the first time in his life, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Inside the debate hall, Alexander and Chairman Feng stood locked in a tense stare-off as security personnel scrambled around them. Feng's expression had turned cold, the mask of calm shattered. His fingers twitched at his side, a subtle signal to his personal guards to close in. "You've started a war you can win," Feng said in a low, venomous tone. "Do you really think exposing this will bring the regime down? We are the foundation of this country. Without us, there is only chaos." Alexander's gaze was steady, but he could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. "The people have lived in your chaos for over a century now. They were fighting for a chance at real freedom." Feng gave a small, chilling smile. "Freedom. The people don't want freedom. They want order, and we provide that. You will see soon enough." With a swift motion, Feng's guards moved to grab Alexander, but he was ready. He ducked to the side, avoiding the first guard's outstretched hand, then slammed his fist into the man's side. A second guard lunged at him, but Alexander used the podium as leverage to flip the man onto the ground. The hall was erupting into violence as party loyalists clashed with Alexander's supporters. The camera feeds went dark, cut off by the party steam's control, but the damage had already been done. Across the nation, the truth was out. Alexander knew he couldn't stay here. He needed to regroup with Alina and the other. He darted toward the exit, dodging the chaos unfolding around him. His mind raced. They had managed to release the information, but now they had to survive long enough to make sure the uprising didn't get crushed before it had a chance to gain momentum. Alina paced inside the safe house, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the wooden table as she awaited the Sci arrival. She didn't trust him, not fully, but desperation had a way of making unlikely alliances. If what Lee said was true, they would need every advantage they could get. The door creaked open, and Ling Wei stepped inside, his face pale but resolute. Alina's eyes narrowed. The party is mobilizing its elite strike force, Lee said without preamble. They were planning to lock down the city within the hour, using military force if necessary. They framed the protesters as violent extremists, shut down communication networks, and cut off any outside influence. Sounds about right, Alina muttered. She glanced at her map of the city spread across the table. Where are they deploying first? Main government district and the industrial sectors. They were going to cut off supply routes and trap the protesters in isolated areas. Alina surmised word as she processed the information. We need to move fast. Alexander is still out there, and we need to get him back here before they tighten the noose. Later added, stepping closer to the map, we can use the underground tunnels to avoid the main streets. They were old, but they should still be intact. For a moment, Alina studied him, trying to gauge his sincerity. Then with a curt nod, she turned to the rest of her team. Get the word out. We remove it. The streets were chaos, and Alexander Dan knew they didn't have much time. He moved swiftly through the back alleys, his mind focused on reaching the safe house. The city's sassy presence of police drones and armored vehicles patrolling the streets made it clear that the party was already moving to crush the resistance. Suddenly, he spotted a group of protesters being cornered by a squad of heavily armed security forces. Their batons and shields gleamed under the harsh streetlights as they pushed the protesters back. The air was thick with tension, and Alexander could see that the protesters, mostly young and unarmed, were no match for the party's enforcers. Without thinking, Alexander charged toward the confrontation. He couldn't stand by and watch as more innocent lives were snuffed out by the regime's brutality. He grabbed a discarded piece of wood from the ground and swung it hard at one of the officers. The guard staggered back, momentarily stunned, and Alexander used the opportunity to rally the protesters. Move. Now he shouted, directing them toward a nearby alley. They hesitated for a second, but then the group surged forward, breaking past the security forces. Alexander remained at the rear, holding off the guards long enough for the protesters to escape. Once they were clear, he turned and bolted down another alley, knowing the party's reinforcements would soon arrive. His muscles ached from the effort, and his breath came in ragged gasps, but he pushed forward. He was so close. Ledwee, Alina, and the others were waiting when Alexander finally burst through the door of the safe house. His clothes were torn, and his face was smeared with dirt and sweat, but his eyes were alight with determination. We need to move fast, Alexander Sanders said, barely pausing to catch his breath. The party's all gonna lock down the city any minute now. As I stepped forward, holding out a tablet with real-time update. I've got the military deployment plan. If we coordinate, we can get key groups of protesters into safe zones before the party can trap them. Alexander looked at him, surprised by the sudden change in allegiance. He had known Ledwee as a loyalist, a man who had worked for the regime for years. But now, standing in the dim light of the safe house, Lee seemed like a different man, one who had made a choice to fight for the right side. We don't have much time, Elena said, cutting through the moment. The military is already moving on the industrial district. If we don't get there in the next 20 minutes, it's gonna be a bloodbath. Alexander nodded. Let's go. As the night deepened, the battle for the city raged on. Protesters clashed with party loyalists in the streets, while the military moved to crush the uprising with brute force. But thanks to Lucia and Elena's strategy, key groups of resistance fighters managed to slip through the cracks, regrouping in safe zones where they could continue their fight. The regime was losing its grip for the first time in a century. The people had a real chance at freedom. But Chairman Fan wasn't going to let that happen without a fight. From his command center in the heart of the capital, Fan watched the chaos unfold on his screen. His face was tight with anger, his youthful features betraying the centuries of power he had accumulated. He had underestimated Alexander Valley, and now the entire nation was on the verge of rebellion. We can still regain control, one of his generals said, standing stiffly by his side. Deploy the strike teams to the key sectors. If we eliminate Liu and his leadership, the resistance will crumble. Fang nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he watched the map of the city, red dots representing the protesters, spreading like wildfire. Do it. It was nearly dawn when the strike teams arrived at the safe house. They moved silently and swiftly, breaking through the outer defenses before anyone had time to react. Alexander, Elena, and Lexa were in the middle of a planning session when the door was blown off its hinges. The fight was brutal and fast. The strike team was well trained, heavily armed, and ruthless. But the resistance fighters were desperate, driven by a fierce need to survive and protect the fragile hope they had sparked. Amid the chaos, Alexander found himself facing one of the strike team cell leaders, a man twice his size and armed with a combat knife. The man lunged, but Alexander dodged, grabbing a broken chair leg and using it to block the next strike. The two grappled, the sounds of gunfire and screams filling the air around them. In the corner of the room, Elena and Leif fought side by side, holding off the soldiers as best they could. But it was clear they were outnumbered. The strike team was overwhelming them, and the resistance defenses were crumbling. Suddenly, a shot rang out, and the strike team leader crumpled to the ground, a bullet hole in his chest. Alexander spun around to see Leif holding a smoking gun in his hand, his expression grim but determined. "We have to go," Leif said, his voice urgent. "Now." Without another word, the three of them bolted for the back exit, slipping out into the pre-dawn darkness as the safe house fell behind them. The sun was rising over the city as they regrouped in a hidden bunker outside the capital. The battle was far from over, but the resistance had survived the night. For now, that was enough. Alexander stood outside, watching as the first rays of light touched the horizon. The city was still burning in the distance, but there was a sense of hope in the air, hope that the regime's stranglehold on power was finally weakening. Elena joined him, her face tired but resolute. "We've bought ourselves some time," she said, "but the party won't stop. They'll come for us again." "I know," Alexander replied softly, "but the people have seen the truth now. They want to go back to living under the partisan light." Leif stepped out of the bunker, joining them in the early morning light. He had risked everything to help the resistance, and now there was no turning back. For the first time in his life, he felt free. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The city of Moscow glittered under a steel gray sky, its sharp towers of glass and concrete reflecting the cold light of dawn. The streets below were crowded as always, with citizens going about their business under the ever-watchful eye of the state. Massive billboards broadcast government-approved messages, each a reminder of the so-called democratic ideals that held the country together. Vote for the people, vote for the future, vote for stability. The same message, year after year, as if stability meant anything more than the continued rule of the Communist Party. Anton Volkov watched the scene from his small apartment window, sipping a cup of bitter black coffee. In another hour, he'd be at his desk writing another fluff piece for the state-run newspaper. He'd long given up any pretense of being a real journalist. His job was simple: report the government's version of events, no questions asked. Elections were coming up again, and this year's candidates were as uninspiring as the last. Each of them handpicked by the party, playing their role in the illusion of choice. Anton sighed, rubbing his temple. His head ached from lack of sleep and too much time spent thinking about things he had no power to change. He glanced at the clock. Time to get ready. As he prepared for another day of work, something caught his eye on the television. The usual dull propaganda had been interrupted by a different face. Anton turned up the volume. A man in his mid-40s, with graying hair and the kind of intensity that didn't come from a script, was speaking directly to the camera. "My name is Mikhail Orlov," the man said, and I am here to tell you the truth about this election. For too long, we've been living under the illusion of democracy. But the time has come to wake up. The people of this country deserve real freedom, not this farce of choice. I stand before you as an independent candidate, not approved by the party, not backed by their money or their influence. I stand for the people. I stand for you. Anton sat down, intrigued. Independent candidates were rare, almost unheard of, and they never made it this far without being quietly removed from the race. Orlov's message was dangerous. It had the potential to stir something in the hearts of the people, something Anton hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The broadcast abruptly cut off, replaced by a government official urging calm and dismissing Orlov's words as the ramblings of a madman. Anton leaned back, chewing on his lip. Orlov wouldn't last long. The state would see to that. Later that day, the newsroom buzzed with activity. Anton's boss, a rotund man named Sergei with thinning hair and a permanent scowl, barked orders as usual. "We were running a piece on Orlov. The higher-ups want him discredited. Start digging into his background. Find any dirt you can if you can. Timed it. Make it up." Anton nodded without protest. He'd done this 100 times before, fabricating scandals or exaggerating minor infractions to ruin someone's reputation. Yeah, it was standard practice for anyone who posed a threat to the regime. Still, something about Orlov's speech gnawed at him. The man didn't seem like a typical opposition puppet, the kind the state allowed to give the appearance of choice. He seemed genuine. After hours of combing through old records, Anton found nothing on Orlov that could be used against him. No shady business deals, no history of corruption, not even a whisper of scandal. It was as if the man had lived a clean life untouched by the grime of politics. Anything, Sergei came from behind him, making Anton jump. "Nothing yet," Anton replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. Sergei grunted. He said, "Not clean. No one is clean. Keep looking. And if you can, to find anything by tomorrow, we'll make sure he's sturdy enough." Anton watched Sergei walk away, his stomach twisting with disgust. He'd spent too many years lying for the regime, but this felt different. This wasn't to some minor candidate who posed no real threat. Orlov had struck a nerve with the public, and that made him dangerous, not just to the government, but to Anton as well. That night, Anton couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Orlov's words echoing in his mind. "I stand for you." It was a simple message, but one that carried weight in a country where freedom was an illusion. Anton hadn't thought about real democracy in years. The last time he'd cared about politics, he'd been fresh out of university, full of ideals, and ready to change the world. But that had been a lifetime ago, before the reality of the regime crushed his spirit. Unable to shake the feeling that something was about to change, Anton got out of bed and sat at his desk. He opened his laptop and began typing. At first, the words came slowly, but as he wrote, they began to flow. He didn't know what he was doing or why, but he couldn't stop. The truth had been buried for too long, and for the first time in years, he felt compelled to dig it up. By dawn, Anton had written an article that laid bare the reality of the election. He detailed the regime's manipulation of votes, the bribery, the threats, the illusion of choice. It was raw, honest, and damning. But he couldn't publish it. If he did, he'd be arrested within hours, his career destroyed, his life ruined. Anton closed the laptop, feeling the weight of his cowardice. He couldn't fight the system, not alone, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that Orlov might be the key to something bigger. The following day, Anton went to work as usual, but something had changed. The newsroom was buzzing with rumors of Orlov's growing popularity. Despite the smear campaign the government had launched, his support had only increased. People were talking about him in hushed tones, passing around his speeches on encrypted messaging apps, whispering about a future where real democracy might be possible. Sergei was furious. "This bastard is making us look weak, Tari," he spat, pacing the floor. "Dairy, we need to shut him down. Now do." Anton watched from his desk. His heart pounding Orlov's fries had become more than just a political movement. It was a threat to the regime's very existence. And if the government couldn't stop him with lies, they would resort to more extreme measures. That evening, Anton received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, his pulse quickening. "Anton Volkov," a female voice asked. "Yes," he replied cautiously. "My name is Alina Novikova. I used to work in the intelligence agency. We need to talk." They met in a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, far from the prying eyes of the government. Alina was in her 30s with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. She got straight to the point. "Orlov is in danger," she said. "The government is planning to assassinate him. They've already made several attempts on his life, but he's managed to evade them so far. But it's only a matter of time." Anton's stomach churned. He had suspected the regime would escalate their tactics, but hearing it confirmed was still a shock. Why are you telling me this? Because you are a journalist, Alina replied. Sutter, you have a platform. You can expose what's happening before it's too late. Anton shook his head. I can tell if I publish anything against the government, they will come for me. I have a family too. Alina leaned forward, her eyes burning with intensity. Probably if you don't talk, I'll kill Orlov, and this country will remain under the regime. Central. You have a chance to make a difference. Anton Danton, waste it. He felt trapped, torn between his fear and a growing sense of responsibility. Alina slid a folder across the table. Inside are documents that prove the government is manipulating the election. They've been rigging the vote for years, and they'll do it again this time unless someone stops them. Anton stared at the folder, his mind racing. This was it, the evidence he needed to take down the regime, but it came with a price. Anton sat in the cafe long after Alina left, the weight of the folder pressing down on him like an anchor. The documents inside it were dangerous. He knew that without even opening them. This was not just some conspiracy theory spun up by disgruntled opposition. It was the raw truth, the kind that could topple government. Anton thought about his wife, Anya, and their young son, Leah. If he went through with this, if he published this information, his family would be in danger. But if he didn't, Mikhail Orlov would die, and with him, the last hope for real change in the country. When Anton finally left the cafe, it was dark, the streets eerily quiet. His mind buzzed with questions, fear, and a small flicker of hope that he hadn't felt in years. The folder felt heavier than ever as he slipped it under his jacket, his heart pounding as he made his way home. Once inside his cramped apartment, Anton locked the door and sat at the kitchen table. Anya was already asleep, their son tucked in beside her. He was alone with the truth now, and it terrified him. Slowly, he opened the folder and began to sift through the papers. There were copies of internal memos from high-ranking officials, detailing how they planned to rig the upcoming election. There were orders for bribes, threats, even instructions for ballot tampering. And then there was the most damning piece, a series of emails between General Pavel Sokolov and the head of the intelligence agency, discussing Tayel, the Orlov problem, Tyus, and planning his assassination. Anton's hands trembled as he read the final memo. The target will be eliminated within the next 48 hours. Ensure media coverage is controlled to prevent any public backlash. The narrative must be maintained. They were going to kill Orlov, and soon. Anton's first instinct was to run to hide the folder and pretend he had never seen it. But that wasn't an option anymore. Orlov was more than just a candidate. Now he was a symbol. And symbols, and Anton knew, were powerful things. They could ignite revolution. He spent the rest of the night writing, fueled by adrenaline and a sense of impending doom. The words poured out of him in a torrent, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he crafted an article that exposed the regime, stock corruption in stark, undeniable detail. He quoted the documents, laid out the evidence, and wove it into a story that was both factual and damning. By dawn, it was finished. Anton stared at the screen, his heart racing. He knew what he had to do, but the weight of it was crushing. Once this was published, there would be no going back. He would become a target, just like Orlov. He thought about Alina's words. You have a chance to make a difference, Anton Don T. wasted. Taking a deep breath, Anton attached the article to an encrypted email and sent it to several underground media outlets. Within minutes, it would be out of his hands, beyond his control. The truth was free now, and there was no stopping it. He closed his laptop, his hands shaking. It was done. The next 24 hours passed in a blur. Anton went to work as usual, trying to keep his head down, but the tension in the air was palpable. The underground press had picked up his article, and it spread like wildfire. By midday, it was all anyone could talk about. The regime's corruption had been exposed for the world to see, and people were furious. Protests erupted across the city. Thousands of people took to the streets demanding real democracy, calling for Orlov's protection. The government responded with force, deploying riot police and military units to control the crowds, but it was clear they were losing their grip. The truth had ignited something deep within the population, something that had been simmering for years. At the newsroom, Sargi was livid. This is a disaster. There he shouted, pacing back and forth. The higher-ups are demanding we discredit this nonsense immediately. Anton sat quietly at his desk, his heart pounding. He knew it was only a matter of time before they traced the article back to him. He'd covered his tracks as best he could, but the state of intelligence apparatus was vast and unforgiving. It wouldn't take long for them to connect the dots. That evening, as Anton made his way home, he noticed a black car idling at the end of his street. His blood ran cold. He'd seen that car before, parked outside the homes of other dissidents just before they disappeared. Without thinking, Anton turned and walked in the opposite direction, ducking into an alley. He pulled out his phone and dialed Alina's number. "They were watching me," he said as soon as she picked up. "I'll get out of the city, DL," she replied, her voice urgent. Anton didn't go home that night. Instead, he met Alina at a safe house on the outskirts of the city where several other activists had gathered. Orlov was there too, looking haggard but determined. He had heard about the article, and it had given him a surge of support like nothing he'd expected. "You did this?" Orlov asked, shaking Anton's hand. "Here you exposed them." Anton nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and fear. "Hey, sure, it's not over yet. They'll come after all of us." "They already are," Orlov said grimly. "The people are with us now. We have a chance, maybe the only chance we'll ever get to change things." Outside, the sound of distant gunfire echoed through the night. The protests were growing more violent, the regime becoming more desperate to cling to power. The next day, the government declared martial law. Tanks rolled through the streets of Moscow, and the media was flooded with messages of stability and order, urging citizens to remain calm. But the people weren't listening anymore. Orlov's movement had become a full-blown revolution, and the regime's efforts to suppress it only fueled the fire. Anton, now a fugitive, stayed hidden in the safe house with Alina and the other activists. They spent their days coordinating with underground networks, organizing protests, and smuggling information to the outside world. Every night, they listened to reports of growing unrest of citizens rising up in cities across the country. But the regime was ruthless. Sokolov's forces cracked down harder than ever, arresting, torturing, and killing anyone suspected of supporting the rebellion. The streets ran red with the blood of those who dared to stand up for freedom. Anton knew it was only a matter of time before the safe house was discovered. The government's reach was too long, its grip too tight, and yet, despite the danger, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. For the first time in years, people were fighting back. They were demanding real democracy, and they weren't backing down. On the third day of martial law, Anton received word that Orlov had been captured. He had been taken in a raid on a protest in Red Square, along with dozens of his supporters. The government was preparing to execute him publicly as a warning to anyone else who dared defy the regime. Anton's heart sank. Without Orlov, the movement would falter. He was the symbol of their resistance, the figurehead that people rallied around. If the regime killed him, they would crush the hope that had sparked this revolution. "We have to save him," Alina said, her voice steady but urgent. "Oracle, if they kill Orlov, it's over." Anton nodded, his mind racing. He didn't know how they could pull off something so impossible, but he knew they had to try. That night, under the cover of darkness, Anton and a small group of activists made their way into the heart of Moscow. The city was under lockdown with military checkpoints on every corner, but they had allies on the inside, people willing to risk everything for the cause. As they approached the government building where Orlov was being held, Anton felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the final gamble. If they succeeded, they could save Orlov and keep the revolution alive. If they failed, they would all die. They moved quickly, silently, slipping past guards and into the basement where Orlov was being kept. Anton's heart raced as they crept through the dimly lit corridors, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. When they finally reached Orlov's cell, Anton couldn't help but feel a surge of relief. Orlov was alive, though barely. His face was bruised, his body battered, but his eyes still burned with determination. "We're getting you out of here." Orlov smiled weakly. "You read a fool for coming after me." "Maybe like Anton," replied, "but fools are the only ones who ever change the world." They freed Orlov, but their escape wasn't quiet. Alarms blared as they raced through the building, and within minutes, they were being pursued by armed guards. Bullets whizzed past them as they ran, and Anton's heart pounded in his chest. They were so close to freedom. But just as they reached the exit, a gunshot rang out. Anton felt a searing pain in his side and stumbled, collapsing to the ground. He gasped for breath, the world spinning around him as blood soaked through his shirt. "Go," he shouted, his vision blurring. "Will he get him out of here?" Elena hesitated, her eyes wide with fear, but Orlov grabbed her arm. "Hey, we have to move." Anton watched as they disappeared into the night, the sound of gunfire fading in the distance. He lay there gasping for breath, knowing that he had done everything he could. The revolution would go on with or without him. And as the darkness closed in, Anton couldn't help but smile. The truth was free. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. Ryan Caldwell's fingers drummed anxiously against the leather steering wheel as he waited for the traffic light to turn green. The afternoon sun blazed through the windshield of his aging sedan, casting a warm glow over his face, yet there was no warmth in his expression. His mind churned with the gravity of what he had uncovered in the past few days, something so massive that it threatened the very core of what his country pretended to stand for. It had started small, just another election campaign. But unlike before, this time Ryan wasn't just reporting on the process from the sidelines as he had once done as a star journalist. This time he was in it. He was a candidate, an outsider with nothing to lose and a burning desire to upend the political machine that had turned the democratic process into a puppet show. He had entered the race for change to challenge the Communist Party's decades-long grip on the government. Yet the opposition was proving far more insidious than even his most paranoid suspicions had led him to believe. The light turned green, and Ryan pressed the gas, navigating through the crowded streets of Metropolis City, the country's beating heart and political hub. Towering skyscrapers loomed overhead, symbols of power and wealth. But beneath the surface, there was a rot spreading, one that had been carefully concealed by years of media control, political maneuvering, and now, as Ryan had discovered, outright manipulation. His thoughts flickered back to that night in the abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city, where he had first stumbled upon the truth. It was a lead given to him by an old friend, Tim Rogers, a tech whiz who had worked for one of the government's many data analysis firms. They used to joke that Tim was like a hacker in a suit, but his recent tone had been far from humorous. They were remaking voters, Ryan people, not real people, but close enough to count. Ryan had brushed it off. At first, the country had always been rife with rumors of election fraud, but creating artificial citizens, it sounded like conspiracy theory fodder. However, Tim's voice had been too steady, too serious, so Ryan had followed the thread, and what he found had shaken him to his core. The factory was a sprawling facility, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and falsified records, its purpose shrouded under the guise of industrial manufacturing. Inside, he had witnessed rows upon rows of synthetic bodies, fully functioning human replicas being assembled, programmed, and registered as voters. Every one of them with a single purpose, to cast their ballot for the Communist Party's candidate, Zhou Yinghui, in the upcoming election. Millions of them, all pre-programmed with fabricated identities, memories, and lives that existed only on paper. Ryan shook his head as the image of that night played back in his mind. He had taken photos, recorded everything he could, but he knew that the evidence alone wasn't high enough. The Communist Party controlled the media, the courts, and the narrative. They would discredit him, paint him as a liar, or worse, make him disappear. He'd seen it happen to others who had gotten too close to the truth. A beep from his phone snapped him back to the present. He glanced at the screen, a text from his campaign manager. Elena Vasquez, meet me at the office ASAP. News broke about the Chorad new voters. Nearest media calling it a dire registration surge. Ryan clenched his jaw. So they were already spinning it. They would make it seem like a miracle of democracy, a newfound participation by the masses. The artificial citizens would blend in with the real voters, their votes indistinguishable from the genuine ones. He made a sharp turn down an alley and parked behind his modest campaign office, a stark contrast to the Communist Party's gleaming headquarters downtown. Elena was already inside, pacing back and forth as he walked in. They were everywhere, she said without preamble, thrusting a tablet into his hand. The news outlets are hailing it as a victory for voter turnout. They were calling it the greatest expansion of democracy since the inception of the Republic. Look at this. Ryan scanned the headlines, his stomach churning. They had anticipated this. The party had laid the groundwork, and now the public was eating it up. No one would question the influx of new voters. They had been primed to see it as progress. We were screwed, Elena said, sinking into a chair. Even if we leak what you found, they'll spin it as a crackpot theory. And once those votes come in, it won't matter what we say, the election will be sealed. Ryan sat down across from her, staring blankly at the screen. There has to be a way, he muttered. We need to get to the public directly, bypass the mainstream media. Alina scoffed. How they control everything: television, radio, the major website. Even the underground platforms are crawling with their plan. There's one option, Ryan said slowly, his mind racing. Tim Sontag. He mentioned something about a secure communication network, a kind of backdoor into the public broadcast system. If we could hack into that, we could air the truth on every device in the country. Elena's eyes widened. That says insane. They detrace it back to us in minutes. We'd either before the broadcast finished. Ryan met her gaze, his face set in determination. We're already dead if we don't do something. I am not letting them steal this election. The air in the room felt heavy with the weight of their decision. Elena knew what Ryan was saying was true. They had no other choice. Fine, she said, her voice soft but steady. But we were going to need more than just the two of us. We'll need a tech team, security, and a plan to escape once the signal goes out. They'll send everything they have after us. Ryan nodded. I know. I'll reach out to Tim and see if he can pull a team together. In the meantime, we need to figure out how to keep the campaign going without drawing suspicion. The days that followed were a blur of frantic planning, secret meetings, and sleepless nights. Ryan said a campaign continued publicly, but behind the scenes, they were preparing for a fight much bigger than a mere election. They were preparing to conspiracy that would shake the country to its foundation. The night before the election, Ryan and Elena sat in a dingy warehouse surrounded by a small group of trusted allies. Tim had come through, bringing with him a group of tech experts capable of hacking into the party's secure network. The plan was simple in theory, but dangerous in execution. They would break into the public broadcast system, air the footage of the artificial citizen factories, and reveal the party's plot to the entire nation. If they succeeded, the truth would spread like wildfire, sparking outrage and hopefully a movement to stop the election from being rigged. If they failed, they would be arrested or killed, and the party would bury the truth along with them. Tim Sen's fingers flew across the keyboard, his face illuminated by the glow of the monitor. I am in, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the computer. We have about 15 minutes before they trace the signal. Ryan took a deep breath and nodded to Elena, who stood at the ready with the video feed. The room was tense, the weight of what they were about to do hanging over them like a storm cloud. Let's do it, Ryan said. With a single click, the broadcast began. The video feed of the factory, the synthetic citizens, the rows upon rows of artificial humans being prepared for the election, all of it streamed live to every screen, every phone, every device across the country. There was no turning back now. Tim's voice broke the silence. We've all got movement. They know we were here. Outside the warehouse, the sound of sirens grew louder, the flashing lights of police and military vehicles reflected in the window. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest as the sirens grew closer. The dim lights of the warehouse flickered against the incoming red and blue flashes from outside. They had known this was coming, but the reality of it felt far more terrifying than any plan they had made. There was no turning back. Now the world was watching, and they had only minutes before the government forces broke down the door and silenced them for good. Tim's hands were a blur on the keyboard, Isaac Holder holding steady. The feed is live across all channels. We've got about 10 minutes before they cut the signal. Ryan nodded, sweat trickling down his forehead. Elena stood beside him, pale but resolute. There was fear in her eyes, but also a flicker of hope, a hope that this broadcast would be the turning point. If they could just get the message out, if they could show people the truth, maybe it would be enough to stop the party in its track. The sound of heavy boots echoed from outside the door. The warehouse had no more than a handful of entry points, and all of them were now surrounded. Through the small, dirty window near the ceiling, Ryan could make out the armored figures of the police and military weapons drawn, their faces hidden behind black visors. They're gonna storm the place any second, Tim said, his voice calm despite the urgency. I'm setting up an automatic rebroadcast in case they manage to cut the live feed. I'll buy us a few more minutes. Ryan clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus. Elena, grab the backups. We need to get out of here as soon as we were done. She nodded and moved toward the equipment bag stashed in the corner. They had prepared for this. They had contingency plans, multiple exit strategies, and safe houses lined up. But Ryan knew there was no guarantee they would make it out alive. The door rattled violently as a battering ram hit it once twice. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. The third strike sent the door crashing inward. Black-clad officers poured into the warehouse like a swarm of insects, their weapons raised, sweeping the room. "Get down," one of the officers shouted. Ryan didn't move. He wasn't going to drop to his knees and give up, not when they were this close. He kept his eyes on Tim, who continued typing furiously. "They're inside," Elena yelled, stepping back from the computers as the officers closed in. Ryan raised his hand slowly, showing them he wasn't T-armed, unarmed. "This is a peaceful Shut it," one of the officers barked, shoving him hard against the wall. His head slammed into the concrete, and pain shot through his skull. Another officer yanked Tim from his chair, slamming him to the ground. The computer still streaming the live footage flickered but remained on. Tim groaned in pain, but he managed to glance back at the screens. "It's still going? We still have time." A sudden burst of static filled the air. Ryan's eyes darted to the monitor. The broadcast was being interrupted. A government override had started to break through their signal, but the video feed of the artificial citizens still flickered through the interference. "We have to get out of here," now Elena shouted, grabbing Ryan's arm as more officers stormed in. He could barely stand, his head swimming from the impact, but he forced himself to move. They had to make it to the backup exit or everything they'd done would be for nothing. They scrambled toward the back of the warehouse, where a narrow service door led to an alley. As they reached the exit, Elena turned to Tim. "Come on." Tim was still on the floor, struggling to push himself up. One of the officers kicked him hard in the ribs, and Tim cried out in pain. Ryan's heart twisted in his chest. He couldn't just leave him. He lunged forward, grabbing Tim by the arm and pulling him up. Together, they stumbled toward the door, the sound of gunfire echoing in the background. It wasn't he aimed at them, not yet, but the tension in the air was thick, and Ryan knew they were seconds away from being caught in a crossfire. They burst through the service door and into the cold night air. The alley was dark, narrow, and filled with the stench of garbage, but it was their only shot at escape. Elena was already a few paces ahead, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she sprinted toward the waiting van at the end of the alley. Ryan half dragged, half carried Tim behind her, his muscles burning with the effort. "We can stop," Ryan panted. "We need to keep moving." Elena nodded, her face pale and determined. They reached the van, and Ryan threw open the back door, shoving Tim inside before climbing in after him. Elena jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door and revving the engine. Just as they pulled out of the alley, the doors of the warehouse burst open again. Officers spilled out into the street, shouting and pointing as they realized their targets were slipping away. "They were coming," Tim gasped, clutching his side. "Go, go, go." Elena floored the gas pedal, and the van shot forward, careening through the darkened street. Ryan glanced behind him, his pulse racing. The police vehicles were already in pursuit, their sirens blaring, their lights flashing like angry beacons in the night. "We were not going to outrun them," Elena said, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. Ryan's mind raced. They needed a plan, something to shake their pursuers, or at least buy them enough time to disappear. "Take the next left," he ordered. "It's an underground tunnel system, about half a mile from here. If we can get to it, we might be able to lose them." Elena didn't hesitate. She swung the van into a sharp left turn, tires screeching as they sped down a narrow side street. The police vehicles followed, but the maneuver had bought them a few precious seconds. As they neared the entrance to the tunnels, Ryan felt the flicker of hope. They were close. If they could just make it inside, the labyrinth of underground passages might give them the cover they needed to escape. "There it," Tim shouted, pointing to the metal grate that marked the entrance to the tunnel system. Elena swerved toward it, and Ryan jumped out of the van, wrenching the grate open with trembling hands. "Hurry," he yelled, motioning for Elena and Tim to follow. The three of them scrambled inside, the sounds of the police vehicles growing fainter as they disappeared into the maze of tunnel. The air was damp and stale, the darkness pressing in on them from all sides. But for the first time in what felt like hours, they were safe, at least for now. Ryan slumped against the cold stone wall, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The truth was out. The broadcast had gone live. The entire nation had seen what the Communist Party had been doing behind closed doors. Now, all they could do was wait for the fallout. Alina sank down beside him, her face still pale, but her eyes burning with fierce determination. "We did it," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the darkness. "We actually did it." Ryan nodded, the weight of the night's events settling heavily on his shoulder. They had risked everything to expose the truth, and now the country stood on the edge of chaos. Protests would break out, questions would be asked, and the party's iron grip on power would begin to slip. But it wasn't over yet. There would be a backlash. The party would fight back with everything they had. This was just the beginning of a much larger battle. Ryan closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself a brief flicker of relief. They had made it this far, and they had to survive the aftermath. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't just felt in years. Hope. This was the start of something bigger than any election. It was the beginning of a revolution. Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. In the heart of a sprawling metropolis, the shimmering skyline reflected the apex of human achievement. Towering glass structures pierced the clouds, and above them, holographic banners of the Communist Party glowed with promises of security, stability, and unity. Every citizen lived under its watchful eye, their thoughts synchronized with the party's doctrine, thanks to the neural implants embedded in their brains from childhood. It was a world where the illusion of choice flourished, but free will had been systematically eradicated. Ethan Ward, once a proud history professor, now found himself in the underbelly of this gleaming utopia, hidden away in the depths of the old city ruin. This was where the forgotten gathered, those who dared to question, those whose minds had resisted the pull of the neural control for just long enough to break free. In the shadows, they whispered of freedom, a distant concept that felt more like a legend than a possibility, but Ethan believed he had to. The awakening army was small, ragtag, even former students, engineers, hackers, and everyday people who had somehow slipped through the cracks of the party, sans all-seeing surveillance. Ethan, their de facto leader, knew time was running out. The party was tightening its grip on the populace, reinforcing the neural implants with stronger signals, erasing any last traces of independent thought. Soon, even the underground resistance would be silent. As Ethan leaned over the digital maps projected on the rickety table, he felt the weight of 1,000 failures pressing on his shoulders. Every operation they launched had been swiftly countered, their movements tracked with uncanny precision. The party's reach was too vast, its technology too sophisticated, and yet they had one last hope, Lena Morrow. Lena had come to them under the cover of darkness a month ago. Her face was pale, haunted by years of working for the regime she now sought to destroy. As one of the top neuroscientists in the city, she'd been instrumental in developing the very technology that controlled the masses. It was her hands that had shaped the neural implants, her genius that had perfected the algorithms that kept every mind in check. "I didn't know," she had whispered when she first arrived, her eyes searching Ethan, sigh for any sign of forgiveness. "Didn't you realize what they were doing?" "Not at first." Ethan had been skeptical at first. It could have been a trap, another of the party's intricate plots to root out the resistance. But something in her desperation, in the way she had risked everything to contact them, convinced him to give her a chance. Now she was their best shot at turning the tide. In the dimly lit bunker, Lena sat at a makeshift workstation, her fingers flying over the keys as she worked on the prototype device that could disrupt the party's Santa control signal. Her brow furrowed with concentration, her mind calculating probabilities, strategies, and worst-case scenarios. Ethan approached her, his footsteps light but deliberate. "How's that going?" he asked, keeping his voice low, though there was no need for it. The bunker was as soundproof as they could make it, though. Ethan never trusted anything fully. Paranoia had kept them alive this long. Lena didn't look up. "It's risky. The device could work, but there is a high chance it'll overload the neural implants. People could die if we activate it too quickly." Ethan frowned. "How many?" Lena paused, finally meeting his gaze. "Tens of thousands, maybe more." The words hung heavy in the air. Ethan crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. Sacrifice had always been part of the plan. Everyone in the awakening army knew they might not live to see the day they freed the city from the party's grip. But this was different. "Is there any way to minimize the risk?" he asked. Lena shook her head. "Not unless we gain access to the central control hub. If we can get inside and adjust the frequency from there, We could release people slowly over time, give their minds a chance to recover, which means a full-scale assault, Ethan muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. We're not equipped for that. We might not have a choice, Lena replied quietly. The party is reinforcing the implants every day. If we wait much longer, the chance of breaking through will disappear entirely. Ethan knew she was right. Minister Zuko, the mastermind behind the party, sound mind control regime, was relentless. Reports had come in of increased surveillance, public executions of suspected dissenters, and new waves of propaganda flooding the media channel. Zahal was tightening his grip, and the city was slipping further into darkness. Let's gather the others, Ethan said after a long pause. We need to discuss our next move. The dim bunker soon filled with the faces of the resistant. Tired, worn, but determined, they gathered around the table where Ethan stood. Beside him, Lena pulled up the schematics of the central control hub, projecting them onto the wall for everyone to see. We're running out of time, Ethan began, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. The party is closing in on us. If we don't act, now we may never get another chance. Lena has developed a device that can disrupt the neural control signals, but we need to activate it from this central hub. Central our only shot at freeing the city. There were murmurs of concern, but no one spoke up. They had all known the risks when they joined the Awakening Army. Ethan glanced at Lena, and she stepped forward. The central hub is heavily fortified, she explained, pointing to the map. The Red Guard will be stationed at every entry point. We'll need a diversion to draw them away, while a smaller team infiltrates the control room. Who's going in? Asked Marcus, one of the younger recruits who had once been a tech genius before the party had taken control of his life. I'll lead the infiltration team. Ethan said Lena will come with me to activate the device. We'll need 2 more volunteers. There was a brief silence before Marcus stepped forward, followed by an older woman named Sarah. She had lost her entire family to the party, social purges, and had nothing left to lose. Weary with you, Sarah said, her voice firm. Ethan nodded. Good. The rest of you will create the diversion. Make it loud, make it messy. We need the Red Guard distracted, long enough for us to get inside. The plan was set, but as the meeting broke up, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of dread that gnawed at him. The mission was suicide, and they all knew it. But if they succeeded, they could break the party's set, hold on the city, and give humanity a chance to fight back. That night, Ethan sat alone in his small makeshift quarters, staring at the map of the city. His thoughts wandered to the days before the party had taken over, when people still believed in choice, in democracy. He remembered teaching students about the importance of free will, about the revolutions that had shaped human history. Now those lessons felt like distant memories from a world that no longer existed. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Lena stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. Can she sleep? She asked, stepping inside. Ethan shook his head. Too much on my mind. Lena sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the map. You're rethinking about the people who might die if we activate the device, aren't you? Yeah, Ethan admitted, but it's not just that. I am thinking about what comes after if we succeed. This city it's been under control for so long, I am not sure people will even know how to live without the party telling them what to think. Lena was silent for a moment. Then she said, freedom is messy, Ethan. It's not perfect, and it's not easy, but it's worth fighting for. We have to believe that. He looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes. She had been part of the system that enslaved their minds, but now she was fighting to free them. If she could believe in a better future, then so could he. We'll make it, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. The following morning, the resistance was in motion. Ethan led his team through the dark alleys and abandoned tunnels that crisscrossed the city, avoiding the surveillance drones that hovered overhead. The air was tense, thick with the anticipation of what was to come. As they neared the central control hub, Marcus hacked into the security grid temporarily, disabling the alarm. The team moved quickly, but the tension was palpable. One wrong move, and the Red Guard would be on them in seconds. At the entrance, they paused, waiting for the signal from the diversion team. The plan was simple, cause as much chaos as possible on the opposite side of the city to draw the Red Guard's attention. The seconds ticked by, and then in the distance, the first explosion echoed through the street. A soft move, Ethan ordered, leading the team inside. The next few minutes were a blur of movement, the team navigating through the labyrinthine corridors of the control hub. They encountered minimal resistance at first, the Red Guard clearly occupied with the diversion. But As they neared the control room, things took a dangerous turn. An alarm suddenly blared to life and red lights flashed, illuminating the darkened corridor. Ethan cursed under his breath. The system must have detected their presence despite Marcus's best effort. Within seconds, the sound of heavy boots pounding on the metal floors echoed from every direction. The Red Guard was coming. "Move," Ethan shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening siren. They sprinted down the corridor, weapons drawn, knowing they were outnumbered and outgunned. But there was no turning back now. The door to the control room was just ahead, a thick steel barrier separating them from their goal. Marcus ran to the control panel, his fingers flying over the keys in a desperate attempt to override the lock. Come on, he muttered, beads of sweat forming on his forehead as he worked. Ethan and Sarah took up positions on either side of the corridor, ready to face the incoming onslaught. In the distance, the sound of gunfire echoed, signaling that their diversion team was still holding the Red Guard's attention. But the guards were too fast. "They're coming," Sarah called out, her grip tightening on her rifle. "Just a few more seconds," Marcus said, his voice strained as he worked against the clock. Ethan saw heart raced, adrenaline flooding his veins. The pounding of footsteps grew louder, closer. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of what was at stake pressing down on him. Every second counted. If they failed here, it would all be over. Finally, with a hiss of pressurized air, the control room door slid open. Marcus let out a sigh of relief, but there was no time to celebrate. "Tired, go." They rushed inside, and Lena immediately moved to the central console. The room was vast, filled with rows of computers and holographic displays, all connected to the neural network that controlled the minds of millions. This was the heart of the system, the place where humanity see free will had been buried beneath layers of code and propaganda. "Lock the door," Ethan shouted, and Marcus slammed his hand on the panel, sealing the room shut behind them. Lena was already at the console, her hands a blur as she connected the prototype device to the central system. Her face was set in a grim mask of concentration as she worked to override the controls and initiate the disruption. Ethan stood by her side, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of trouble. But it wasn't long before they heard the pounding at the door. The Red Guard had arrived. "They were trying to break through," Marcus said, his voice tensed low. "That door won't hold for long." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. They needed more time. "Jelena, how long until the device is ready?" "Minutes, maybe less," she replied, her voice calm, despite the chaos unfolding around them. "I just need to adjust the frequency, or else we risk killing everyone with an implant." Ethan turned to Marcus and Sarah. "Hold the door as long as you can. We need every second." Marcus and Sarah took their positions, weapons ready, as the pounding on the door grew louder. The Red Guard was relentless, their efforts to break through intensifying with each passing moment. The metal creaked and groaned under the pressure, and Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before they broke through. "Almost there," Lena said, her voice tight with focus as she made the final adjustment. The hum of the central system grew louder, the lights flickering as the device integrated itself with the neural network. Suddenly, the door burst open with a deafening crash, and the Red Guard stormed in, their rifles raised. Marcus and Sarah opened fire, the sound of gunfire echoing through the room. Ethan dove behind a console, returning fire as the guards pushed forward. The air was thick, with the smell of gunpowder and the sound of bullets breaking off metal surfaces. But they were outnumbered. For every guard they took down, two more appeared, advancing with ruthless precision. Marcus grunted as a bullet grazed his arm, but he didn't. He stopped firing. Sarah's face was a mask of grim determination as she held her ground, but it was clear they couldn't hold them off much longer. "Lena," Ethan shouted over the gunfire, "we're running out of time." "Almost there," she replied, her fingers flying over the keys. "Carry just a few more seconds." Ethan ducked as a bullet whizzed past his head, his heart pounding in his chest. He fired another shot, but the guards kept coming. They were too close now, almost upon them. Desperation clawed at him, but he couldn't afford to lose hope. Not now, not when they were so close. And then just as it seemed all hope was lost, Lena Saul's voice rang out. "Right, it's on. Done. With a final keystroke, the device activated and a low hum filled the room. The lights flickered once more, and then, as if on cue, the guards stopped in their track. They froze, their expressions blank, their weapons falling to their sides as the neural implants in their brains shut down. Ethan stared in disbelief as the guards stood motionless, their minds no longer under the party's control. He believe it. It had worked, they had done it. But there was no time to celebrate. Lena slumped against the console, exhausted, but her eyes were bright with victory. "Sir, we need to get out of here before they reboot the system." Ethan nodded, adrenaline still coursing through him. "Tiara, Marcus, Sarah, let's move." They sprinted out of the control room, leaving the stunned guards behind. As they made their way through the corridors, the sounds of chaos echoed around them. The city was waking up. People were regaining control of their minds, and the realization of what had been done to them was spreading like wildfire. But so was the party-size response. Alarms blared across the city, and the Red Guard was mobilizing to restore order. Ethan knew they had little time before the full force of the regime came crashing down on them. Outside, the city was in turmoil. People flooded the streets, their expressions a mixture of confusion and anger as they tried to make sense of what had happened. Some clutched their heads in pain, the sudden return of free thought overwhelming them, while others shouted in defiance, their voices rising above the chaos. Ethan led his team through the chaos, keeping to the shadows as they made their way toward the rendezvous point. They had planned for this moment, had prepared an escape route that would take them to the outskirts of the city, where the party's control was weakest. But even with the plan in place, the danger was far from over. As they neared the edge of the city, they heard the unmistakable sound of gunfire and the roar of approaching vehicles. The party's forces were closing in, determined to crush the rebellion before it could spread any further. Ethan's heart sank. They weren't going to make it. Suddenly, a voice crackled over his earpiece. "Sorry, Ethan, we've got you covered." It was the diversion team. Against all odds, they had held out long enough to regroup and were now moving to cover their escape. Ethan felt a surge of relief. They might just make it, after all. With renewed determination, Ethan and his team sprinted toward the rendezvous point, where the rest of the awakening army was waiting. As they ran, the sounds of the city in revolt filled the air: explosions, gunfire, and the cries of the people waking up from a long, dark sleep. By the time they reached the outskirts, dawn was beginning to break, casting a pale light over the city. The awakening army had gathered, their faces weary but filled with hope. They had done the impossible. They had broken the party's control. But as Ethan looked back at the city, he knew the fight was far from over. The party was wounded, but it wasn't defeated. They would regroup, and the battle for freedom would continue. But for the first time in years, Ethan believed they had a chance. Lena stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Tira, this is just the beginning." "Tira," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, but it's a restart." Together, they turned and walked into the dawn, ready to face whatever came next.